The indentation on Mrs. Chen's finger looked fresh, as if someone had slipped the ring off just hours before we opened her casket. My name is Margaret Hayes, and I've been a funeral director at Willowbrook Cemetery for 23 years. In all that time, I've handled over 4,000 burials, cremations, and exhumations. I thought I'd seen everything death could offer. The peaceful passings, the tragic accidents, the families torn apart by grief. But Mrs. Chen's case taught me that some mysteries follow us into the ground and refuse to stay buried. Mrs. Eleanor Chen had been interred in Plot 47B on a gray October morning 6 months earlier. I remember the service clearly because of how her husband had wept not the quiet tears most widowers shed, but deep, body-shaking sobs that echoed across the cemetery grounds. He'd insisted on staying until the last shovelful of earth was placed, his weathered hands gripping the handles of his walker as he watched his wife of 52 years disappear beneath the soil. The exhumation order came from the family's attorney, something about relocating her remains to a family plot in California where their daughter lived. Standard procedure, really. We get maybe 3 or 4 of these requests each year, usually families moving across the country who want their loved ones closer. I assigned Jimmy and Marcus to the dig, scheduled it for early morning when the grounds would be quiet. Everything seemed routine until we lifted the casket. The mahogany gleamed in the morning sun, still pristine despite its months underground. But when we opened it in the preparation room, the first thing I noticed was Mrs. Chen's left hand. Her wedding ring was gone. The simple gold band that had been photographed for our records, that I'd personally verified was in place before sealing the casket. Jimmy suggested maybe it had shifted during transport, fallen somewhere in the silk lining. We searched thoroughly, lifting her gently, checking every fold of fabric. Nothing. But the indentation on her ring finger was there, clear as day. The skin still showing the pale circle where the band had rested. Only the mark looked fresh, not like something that had been there for months. That's when I decided to check our security footage. Willowbrook installed new cameras the year before, motion-activated units that recorded everything on the grounds from sunset to sunrise. I pulled up the files from Mrs. Chen's section, Plot 47B, dating back to her burial, for weeks. Nothing unusual, just the occasional deer or maintenance crew making their rounds. Then I found it. Starting exactly 1 week after the burial, every night at midnight, the camera would activate. A figure would appear at the edge of the frame, walking slowly toward Mrs. Chen's grave. At first, I thought it was a mourner, maybe Mr. Chen visiting his wife. But as the figure got closer to the camera, I could see it wasn't him. This person was taller, younger, moving with purpose rather than grief. The figure would kneel at the graveside for exactly 7 minutes, then disappear back into the darkness beyond the camera's range. This happened every single night for nearly 6 months, right up until the day before we scheduled the exhumation. I tried to enhance the footage, but the cemetery's lighting was too dim to make out details. The figure remained a shadow, kneeling in the same spot, night after night. What disturbed me most was how the camera always seemed to catch them mid-visit, never arriving or leaving, as if they materialized at the grave and vanished when their time was up. The morning of the exhumation, I decided to call Mr. Chen. I needed to know if he'd been visiting the grave regularly, if maybe he'd seen anyone else there. His voice was shaky when he answered, and when I mentioned the missing ring, he went completely silent. "Mr. Chen, are you there? I need to tell you something," he whispered finally. "Eleanor wasn't wearing her wedding ring when she died. I have it here, in my jewelry box. I buried something else with her, something that was supposed to stay buried." My blood went cold. "What do you mean? The ring you saw wasn't hers. It was Lisa's ring. Our daughter. She disappeared 30 years ago, and we never found her body. Eleanor kept that ring all these years, wore it on a chain around her neck. When she got sick, she made me promise to bury it with her, so Lisa would know we never stopped looking. I stared at the empty indentation on Mrs. Chen's finger, understanding flooding through me like ice water. Mr. Chen, what did Lisa look like? She was tall for a woman, about 5'8". She would be 53 now, if she were still. His voice broke. That night, I stayed late at the cemetery, sitting in my office with a clear view of plot 47B. I'd moved Mrs. Chen's remains to the mausoleum for the night, but something told me the vigil wasn't over. At 11:59, I saw her, a tall figure, emerging from the tree line, walking with that same purposeful stride I'd watched on months of security footage. She knelt where her mother's grave had been, where only empty earth remained, and stayed for exactly 7 minutes. In the moonlight, I could see her face clearly for the first time. She had Mrs. Chen's cheekbones, her elegant neck. She was searching for something in the dark soil, her hands moving frantically through the dirt. When she looked up toward my office window, our eyes met across the cemetery grounds. Her mouth opened in a silent cry, and she pressed her hand to her chest, right where a necklace might rest. Then she was gone, fading into the darkness like mist. The next morning, I found something half buried in the loose soil of plot 47B. A thin gold chain, broken, with a wedding ring still hanging from it. Inside the band was an inscription. To Lisa, my daughter, my heart. I never told Mr. Chen what I found. Some things are meant to stay buried, and some vigils are meant to continue. But I still check the cameras sometimes, hoping to catch a glimpse of that tall figure, keeping watch over the empty plot, still searching for what was taken from her so long ago. The ring sits in my desk drawer now, and every night at midnight, I swear I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my office, pacing back and forth like someone waiting for visiting hours to begin. The wooden box wasn't there when I sealed David Hartley's casket, but somehow it had found its way into his dead hands. I'm Rose Valdez, and I've been an embalmer at Serenity Funeral Home for 19 years. My hands have prepared thousands of bodies for their final rest, folding their arms just so, positioning their heads at the perfect angle for viewing. I take pride in my work, in the dignity I give to those who can no longer speak for themselves. But David Hartley's case shattered something fundamental about what I thought I knew about death and the secrets it keeps. David had been a quiet man in life, a librarian who lived alone, no family to speak of except for a distant cousin who arranged the funeral. When his body came to us after the heart attack, there was nothing unusual about him. Mid-50s, graying hair, soft hands that spoke of a life spent turning pages rather than working with tools. I embalmed him with the same care I gave everyone, dressed him in the navy suit his cousin had provided, and folded his arms across his chest in the traditional position. The viewing was small, just a handful of library colleagues and a few neighbors. I remember checking on him twice during calling hours, adjusting his tie, making sure everything remained perfect. His hands were exactly where I'd placed them, empty and peaceful. 3 days later, his cousin decided on burial in the family plot upstate. Standard procedure, we sealed the casket, loaded it onto the transport van, and I personally signed off on the transfer documentation. Everything was by the book. The exhumation order came 18 months later. Something about consolidating family remains in a newer cemetery. I wasn't surprised. These requests had become more common as families scattered across the country. What surprised me was that the cousin specifically requested I be present when they opened the casket, wanted me to verify that David was in good condition for the move. When we lifted the casket from the grave that gray morning in November, I noticed immediately that something felt different. Not the weight that was about right for a body that had been buried for a year and a half. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. The casket felt occupied, if that makes sense. Not just by a body, but by a presence. We transported it back to Serenity's preparation room, the same space where I'd worked on David originally. I'd done dozens of these verifications before, just a quick look to make sure everything was intact, then reseal and move to the new location. Routine work, but when I opened David's casket, I nearly stumbled backward. His body was perfectly preserved, exactly as I'd left him 19 months earlier. Same suit, same positioning, same peaceful expression. But clutched in his hands was a small wooden box, maybe 4 inches square, with intricate carvings along its edges. I stared at it for a long moment, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I somehow missed it during the original preparation? Had his cousin placed it there without telling me? No, I knew my work. I'd personally folded David's hands, checked them twice during the viewing. They'd been empty. The box was locked, held shut by a tiny brass clasp that looked old, much older than David himself. My first instinct was to call his cousin, but something about the way David's fingers were wrapped around it gave me pause. He was holding it protectively, the way a child might clutch a favorite toy. His arms, which I'd positioned in the standard funeral pose, had somehow shifted to cradle the box against his chest. I tried to lift it gently, but David's grip was firm, not rigid with rigor mortis that had long since passed, but firm in a way that suggested he didn't want to let go. I had to work carefully, finger by finger, to loosen his hold on the mysterious box. When I finally freed it, the box felt warm in my hands. Not body temperature warm, but genuinely warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight. The brass clasp clicked open at my touch, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. Inside, nestled in faded red velvet, was a single small tooth, a child's tooth, yellowed with age, and beneath it, a folded piece of paper. The note was written in a child's careful handwriting, each letter formed with the concentration of someone just learning cursive. My name is Tommy Breslin. I am 8 years old. If you find this, tell my mom I went to the library like I said. The man with the gray hair helped me find a special book. He said we had to keep it secret. My hands began to shake. Tommy Breslin. I knew that name. 30 years ago, when I'd first started working at Serenity, Tommy Breslin had been front page news for 3 weeks. 8 years old. Disappeared walking home from the public library on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Search parties, police investigations, candlelight vigils. His parents had aged years in those weeks, appearing on local television with his school photograph, begging anyone with information to come forward. They never found him. The case went cold, became one of those unsolved mysteries that haunted the town's collective memory. I remembered his mother's face in particular, the hollow-eyed woman who would come to every funeral we held for months afterward, as if searching for her son among the dead. David Hartley had worked at the library for over 20 years. He would have been there when Tommy disappeared. He would have been the man with gray hair who helped children find books. I rewrapped the tooth carefully, placed it back in the box with the note, and sat staring at David's peaceful face. His expression hadn't changed, but somehow he looked different now. Less peaceful, more expectant. As if he'd been waiting 19 months for someone to open that box, to find what he'd been carrying. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe David had found the tooth years ago, kept it as some kind of twisted memento. Maybe the box had fallen into the casket during transport. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality after too many years spent with the dead. But deep down, I knew the truth was simpler and more terrible. David had taken that tooth from Tommy Breslin 30 years ago, and Tommy had managed to get his message to the one place David couldn't destroy it, into death itself. I called the police that afternoon, turned over the box and its contents. The detective who took my statement was the same officer who'd worked the original case as a young patrolman. His hands shook when he read Tommy's note. They searched David's house, found nothing. But 2 days later, using ground-penetrating radar in the basement, they discovered what was left of Tommy Breslin buried beneath the foundation. The medical examiner confirmed it was him from dental records, all teeth present, except for one small molar. The night before David's reburial, I stayed late at the funeral home, sitting with his casket in the preparation room. I'd removed the box, of course, given it to the authorities. But David's hands seemed wrong now, empty and purposeless. I found myself wondering if the dead could feel relief, if Tommy's message reaching the surface had somehow freed them both from whatever terrible secret had bound them together. As I prepared to seal the casket for the final time, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, pressed into the satin lining where the box had rested, was a small indentation, the perfect shape of a child's handprint, as if Tommy had reached through death itself to reclaim what was his. I sealed David Hartley's casket and never spoke of what I saw that night. But sometimes, in the quiet hours when I'm working alone in the preparation room, I hear the sound of small footsteps in the hallway, and I know that some messages refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you plant them in the earth. When we dug up Miguel Valdez's grave, his casket was facing east instead of west, and the soil above him looked like it had never been disturbed. My name is Jim Crawford, and I've been maintaining the grounds at Peaceful Hills Cemetery for 31 years. I know every headstone, every tree, every plot of grass in this place like they were rooms in my own house. I can tell you which graves flood in heavy rain, which monuments need extra attention from vandals, and exactly how long it takes me to mow each section. What I can't tell you is how 4 caskets managed to turn themselves around underground without disturbing so much as a dandelion on the surface. Miguel Valdez was buried on a Tuesday morning in March, Plot 9C, in row 9. I remember because it was one of those perfect spring days that make this job feel less like work and more like tending a garden. The family had chosen a simple pine casket, and we'd positioned him with his head to the west, feet to the east, same as every burial in that section for the past 40 years. Standard practice, following the old Christian tradition of facing the rising Sunday. I personally supervised the burial, operated the lowering device, watched as the Valdez family threw handfuls of earth onto the casket before we filled the grave completely. Everything by protocol, everything exactly where it should be. 6 months later, the family decided to move Miguel to a family plot in Texas, where his grandchildren could visit more easily. Happens more often than you'd think. Families scattered by economics and opportunity, trying to stay connected even in death. I scheduled the exhumation for early morning, when the cemetery would be quiet and we could work without disturbing visitors. Carlos and Danny started digging at sunrise. Row 9 sits on level ground with good drainage, so we expected to reach the casket by mid-morning. But after 3 hours of careful excavation, they hit something unexpected about 4 feet down. The vault was there, exactly where we'd left it. But when we lifted the concrete lid, the casket inside was positioned backwards, not shifted or rotated, completely reversed. Miguel's head was now pointing east, his feet to the west. The casket itself showed no signs of damage, no scratches or dents that might suggest it had been moved or manipulated. The vault was intact, the seals unbroken. But somehow, in the 6 months since we'd buried him, Miguel Valdez had turned around. I stared down into that neat rectangular hole, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. In 31 years, I'd never encountered anything like this. Caskets don't rotate themselves. The laws of physics don't take coffee breaks just because someone's dead. Yet there it was, clean and impossible, like a magic trick performed 6 feet underground. Carlos suggested maybe we'd made a mistake during the original burial, positioned the casket wrong in our haste. But I keep detailed records of every interment, including photographs. I pulled Miguel's file from my truck and checked the pictures I'd taken before filling the grave. Clear as day. Head west, feet east. Exactly as it should be. That afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong in row 9. I walked the section slowly, checking each headstone, each plot marker, looking for anything unusual. The grass grew evenly, the flowers families had planted were healthy, The monument stood straight and clean. Everything looked perfectly normal. But when I consulted my burial records, I found something that made my hands start to shake. Plot 9A, buried 2 years earlier. Maria Santos, head positioned east, feet west. According to my notes and photographs, I'd buried her facing west. Plot 9B, interred 8 months ago. Robert Chen, head east, feet west. My records showed him buried facing west as well. Plot 9D, the most recent burial before Miguel. Sarah Thompson, head east, feet west. Another discrepancy. Every single grave in row 9 showed the same impossible reversal. I spent the rest of that afternoon digging through burial records, cross-referencing my files with the cemetery's master database. Row 9 had been in use for 12 years, containing 37 burials total. According to official documentation, every single person in that section had been interred, following standard protocol, head to the west. But my photographs, taken systematically at every burial, told a different story. Sometime between interment and exhumation, every person buried in row 9 had turned themselves around to face the opposite direction. That evening, I called in a favor from my brother-in-law, who works construction and has access to ground-penetrating radar equipment. I told him I suspected we might have a sinkhole developing, needed to check the soil stability. It wasn't entirely a lie. Something was definitely unstable in row 9, just not in the way he'd understand. The radar results were worse than I'd imagined. Not only were all 37 caskets facing east instead of west, but they were arranged in a perfect pattern, each one positioned exactly the same distance from its neighbors, forming neat rows like soldiers in formation. The precision was impossible, inhuman. No amount of soil settling or underground water movement could account for such systematic organization. But the radar picked up something else, something that made my blood run cold. Deep beneath row 9, maybe 15 feet down, was a large rectangular structure. Something that had been there long before we'd started using that section for burials. Something we'd been unknowingly building on top of for 12 years. I researched the cemetery's history, dug through county records and old newspaper archives. Peaceful Hills had been farmland originally, then briefly served as a temporary camp during World War II. But in the 1800s, before any of that, the land had been used for something else entirely. There had been a small church there, built by German immigrants who'd settled in the area after the Civil War. The congregation had dwindled over the years, and by 1900, the church had been abandoned. According to local records, the building had burned down in 1908, but the cemetery behind it had remained in use for another decade before being forgotten entirely. The rectangular anomaly beneath row 9 was the foundation of that old church, and our modern graves were positioned directly above where the altar would have been. Somehow, the dead we'd buried there were responding to the sacred space beneath them, turning to face what their bodies somehow recognized as consecrated ground. I never reported my findings to the cemetery administration. Some discoveries are too strange for official documentation, too impossible for bureaucratic minds to process. Instead, I quietly changed our burial procedures for row 9. Now, when families choose plots in that section, I position their loved ones facing east from the beginning, letting them rest in the direction they seem to prefer. Miguel Valdez was reburied in Texas as his family requested, but not before I noticed something that still gives me chills. When we loaded his casket onto the transport truck, I could swear I heard a soft sigh escape from inside, as if he were reluctant to leave the company of those 36 other souls who had found their proper orientation in the darkness beneath row 9. Sometimes, late in the evening when I'm locking up the maintenance shed, I walk through row 9 one more time. In the fading light, the headstones look like they're all leaning slightly eastward, as if the entire section is listening for something I can't hear. And in the distance, just at the edge of perception, I swear I can sometimes hear the faint sound of church bells ringing beneath the ground, calling the faithful to an everlasting service that began more than a century ago. She watches every exhumation from behind the old oak tree, but when I developed the photos from the Henderson job, she wasn't there. I'm Luis Morales, and I've been driving transport for Hillcrest Memorial Services for 14 years. My route covers 6 counties and 17 different cemeteries, moving bodies from funeral homes to grave sites, handling exhumations and transfers when families need their loved ones relocated. It's quiet work mostly, dignified work, and I've always taken pride in treating each person I transport with the respect they deserve in their final journey. Sycamore Cemetery sits on a hill overlooking the Clearwater River, and it's one of my regular stops. Small place, maybe 300 graves total, established back in 1892 when the town was still a logging camp. There's an old oak tree near the center of the grounds that must be 100 years old, its branches spreading wide enough to shade a dozen graves. Beautiful spot, peaceful, the kind of place where you wouldn't mind spending eternity. I first noticed her during the Patterson exhumation 3 years ago. Elderly woman in a yellow dress, standing behind that oak tree, watching our work with the kind of attention you'd expect from family. But when I asked the funeral director about her, he said the Pattersons didn't have any living relatives. That's why they were moving the body to the county pauper section. I figured maybe she was just a neighbor, someone who remembered the deceased and wanted to pay respects. But then she was there for the next one too. The Morrison transfer 2 months later, same yellow dress, same position behind the oak tree, same careful attention to our work. This time I mentioned her to my supervisor, wondering if maybe we needed to notify her about the exhumation schedule for safety reasons. He looked at me like I was confused and said he hadn't seen anyone. That's when I started paying closer attention. Every exhumation I've handled at Sycamore Cemetery since then, and there have been 11 of them, she's been there. Always the same spot, always the same dress, always watching with the kind of focus that suggests she's waiting for something specific. She never approaches, never interferes with the work, just stands there among the shadows cast by those oak branches and observes everything we do. I tried talking to her once, during the Williams exhumation last spring, called out a friendly greeting, asked if she needed help finding a particular grave. She looked right at me, nodded politely, then turned and walked deeper into the cemetery grounds. I followed, thinking maybe she was lost or confused, but when I rounded the monument she'd passed behind, she was gone, vanished like she'd never been there at all. The groundskeeper at Sycamore is an old-timer named Pete Kowalski, who'd been caring for the place for 25 years. When I asked him about the woman in the yellow dress, his face went pale. He looked around, like he was checking to make sure we weren't overheard, then pulled me aside. "You've seen her too?" he asked, in a voice barely above a whisper. Turns out Pete had been noticing her for years, long before I'd started working that route. Not just during exhumations, but at night sometimes, when he'd stay late to finish mowing or repair work. He'd catch glimpses of yellow moving among the headstones, always near that old oak tree, always just far enough away that he couldn't make out details. "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell," he said finally, "buried here in 1987, plot 12C, right there under the oak tree. Lung cancer took her at 73. She'd been visiting graves here for years before she died, bringing flowers to people who didn't have family left to remember them. Sweet woman. Never missed a Sunday." I felt cold despite the warm afternoon. "You're saying she's—" "I'm not saying anything," Pete cut me off. "Just telling you who she was when she was alive. What she's doing now, well, that's between her and the good Lord." That night, I went home and developed the photographs from the Henderson exhumation, the job we'd finished that morning. I always take pictures for insurance purposes, documenting the condition of the site before and after we work. Standard procedure. Nothing unusual about it. But as I looked through the prints, I realized something that made my hands shake. Every photo that should have shown the area around the oak tree was clear. No figure in yellow, no woman watching from the shadows. just empty grass and filtered sunlight, as if she existed in some space between what my eyes could see and what the camera could capture. I started bringing a digital camera after that, thinking maybe it was an issue with film processing. Same result. I tried video recording on my phone. Nothing. She was visible to anyone standing in Sycamore Cemetery during an exhumation. Solid enough to cast shadows, real enough to nod and walk away when spoken to. But somehow she existed outside the reach of any recording device. The breakthrough came during the Chen exhumation 6 months ago. I was positioning the winch when I noticed her in her usual spot. But this time she wasn't alone. A younger woman stood beside her, maybe 30 years old, wearing a blue dress that looked like it belonged to the 1950s. Then another figure appeared, an older man in a dark suit, and then another woman, this one in what looked like a nurse's uniform. By the time we finished loading the casket, there were 12 people standing behind that oak tree, all watching our work with the same careful attention. All of them dressed in clothes from different eras, all of them perfectly solid and real to my eyes. None of them showed up in any of the photos I took. I checked the cemetery records that afternoon, cross-referencing burial dates with the clothing styles I'd observed. Every person I'd seen matched someone buried at Sycamore, stretching back to the cemetery's founding. Mrs. Hartwell wasn't just watching the exhumations, she was organizing them, gathering the other residents to witness each departure, making sure no one left without a proper farewell from those who'd stayed behind. The most recent exhumation was the Henderson job last week. Simple family transfer. Nothing unusual about the paperwork or the procedure. But when I arrived at Sycamore that morning, the crowd behind the oak tree was larger than I'd ever seen it. Maybe 30 people, all dressed in their burial clothes, all standing in perfect silence as we worked. And at the front of the group, Mrs. Hartwell, in her yellow dress, hands folded, head bowed slightly as if she were saying a prayer for the departing soul. When we loaded Mr. Henderson's casket onto the truck, she looked directly at me and smiled. Not the sad smile of someone mourning, but the satisfied smile of someone whose work was finally complete. I haven't seen her since. The groundskeeper says the cemetery feels different now, quieter somehow. The old oak tree stands empty during my visits, its shade falling on nothing but grass and headstones. Sometimes, I wonder if Mrs. Hartwell found whatever she'd been looking for in all those years of watching and waiting. Or maybe she realized that some farewells don't need witnesses, that the dead know how to say goodbye to each other in ways the living can't understand. But I still bring my camera to every exhumation at Sycamore Cemetery, hoping to catch one more glimpse of that yellow dress among the shadows. Because in 14 years of transport work, she's the only person who ever made me feel like what I do matters to the people I serve, even after they can no longer speak for themselves. The scratches in Edward Kowalski's casket lining were fresh, and the tape recorder hidden beneath his pillow played his voice, saying words he'd never spoken in life. I'm Daniel Webb, and I've been preparing the dead for final viewing at Restwood Funeral Home for 27 years. In that time, I've learned that death has its own language, the way skin settles, how muscles relax, the particular stillness that comes over a face when the last breath leaves the body. I thought I understood this language, until Edward Kowalski taught me that some conversations with death refuse to end, even after the words should have stopped forever. Edward came to us on a Thursday in November, 78 years old, passed peacefully in his sleep according to the medical examiner. Natural causes, no signs of distress or struggle. His daughter made the arrangements. She wanted a traditional viewing, 3 days in our largest suite, followed by burial in the family plot. Standard service, nothing complicated about it. I worked on Edward that Thursday evening in Preparation Room 2, the same room where I've handled thousands of cases over the years. He was a small man, maybe 5'6", with calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime working with tools. His daughter had brought me a navy suit, crisp white shirt, his wedding ring, and a pair of reading glasses she said he never went anywhere without. The embalming went smoothly. No complications with the arterial system or fluid distribution. I positioned him carefully in the mahogany casket his daughter had selected, hands folded over his chest, head tilted slightly to the right to catch the soft lighting we use in Suite 12. Everything perfect. Everything exactly as it should be for a man who deserved dignity in his final farewell. The viewing was scheduled to start Friday evening, but I always arrive early to make final adjustments, ensure everything looks perfect for the family. That's when I first noticed something was wrong with Edward's positioning. His hands had shifted during the night, moved from the careful fold I'd arranged to a more relaxed position at his sides. Not unusual in itself, bodies settle, muscles release tension, but something about the change bothered me. I repositioned his hands and checked the rest of his appearance. The suit was slightly wrinkled, as if he'd been moving in his sleep. His reading glasses, which I'd carefully cleaned and positioned, were askew. Small details, easy to fix, but they added up to an impression that Edward hadn't been resting peacefully in his casket. The first viewing session went smoothly. Maybe 40 people came to pay their respects. Neighbors, former co-workers, members of his church. His daughter held up well, greeting everyone with the kind of composed grief that comes from having time to prepare for a loss. I stayed in the background, available if needed, but letting the family have their private moments with Edward. But that night, after the building was locked and everyone had gone home, I decided to check on Suite 12 one more time. Call it professional habit or just intuition. But something drew me back to Edward's casket in the quiet darkness of the funeral home. The silk lining showed fresh scratches, long, deliberate marks running along both sides of the casket interior, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across the fabric. The scratches were deep enough to catch the light, unmistakably new. Edward's fingernails, which I'd carefully cleaned and trimmed during preparation, were worn down to the quick. I stood there in the dim lighting of Suite 12, trying to process what I was seeing. The scratches formed a pattern, not random scrapes, but deliberate marks. They looked almost like letters, though I couldn't make out specific words in the torn silk. Edward's hands were positioned differently again, this time clutched into fists, as if he'd been holding onto something. I lifted his right hand carefully, and that's when I found the tape recorder. It was small, the kind of device people use for reminders or dictation, no bigger than a deck of cards. It had been hidden beneath the pillow we'd placed under Edward's head. The cord snaked up through the silk lining to a tiny speaker positioned near his ear. The device was still running, the little red light blinking steadily in the darkness. I pressed the rewind button and listened to what it had been playing. Edward's voice, clear and unmistakable, whispering the same phrase over and over, "I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready yet." But his voice sounded wrong somehow, strained and desperate in a way that didn't match the peaceful expression on his face. These weren't words he'd ever spoken in life. His daughter had told me he'd accepted his illness with grace, had made his peace with dying months before the end came. The timestamp on the recorder showed it had been running for 6 hours, the same phrase repeating in an endless loop since sometime around midnight. I rewound further, hoping to find the beginning of the recording, some explanation for how it had gotten into Edward's casket. Instead, I found something that made my blood run cold. The earlier part of the tape wasn't Edward's voice at all. It was mine. My own voice, recorded during the embalming process, talking to Edward the way I always talk to the people I work on. I explain what I'm doing as I work, a habit I developed years ago to maintain the dignity of the process. Now I'm going to position your hands, Edward. There we go. Nice and comfortable. Your daughter wants you to look peaceful for the viewing. But on the tape, Edward was responding. "I can hear you, Daniel. I'm not ready to look peaceful. I'm not ready for any of this." His voice was clear and conversational, nothing like the desperate whisper I'd heard moments before. "I know I'm dead, but I'm not finished yet. There are things I need to say, things I need to fix. I fast-forwarded through the recording, finding more of these impossible conversations. Edward telling me about mistakes he'd made, people he'd hurt, words he'd never gotten the chance to say. My own voice responding with the routine comments I make during preparation, completely unaware that I was part of a dialogue with a dead man. "My daughter thinks I was a good father," Edward's voice said at one point. "But I wasn't always." I was angry when her mother died, angry at God and the world, and I took it out on her. She was just 16, grieving too, and I made it worse. I need her to know I'm sorry before I go. The recording continued through the night, Edward's voice growing more desperate as the hours passed, my own voice carrying on one-sided conversations about clothing adjustments and cosmetic touches. By dawn, Edward had given up trying to communicate coherent messages and had started the endless repetition. "I'm not ready yet." I sat in Suite 12 until sunrise, listening to the entire tape, trying to understand how Edward's voice had been captured during a process where he should have been incapable of speech. The recording was impossible, but it was also real, playing through speakers hidden in his casket while his body lay perfectly still and silent above. When Edward's daughter arrived for the second day of viewing, I pulled her aside. I couldn't tell her about the tape recorder, she'd think I'd lost my mind, but I could ask about her relationship with her father, about any unfinished business between them. "He was wonderful to me," she said, but something in her eyes suggested otherwise, especially after Mom died. "He tried so hard to be both parents, but I could tell he was struggling. I always wished we could have talked more about those years, but he seemed to think it was better left in the past." I nodded and helped her arrange flowers around the casket, but I was thinking about Edward's recorded voice, about his desperate need to apologize for things his daughter might not even remember as wounds. That evening, after the viewing hours ended, I made a decision that probably violated every professional ethics rule in my industry. I played the tape for her, not the desperate repetition from the early morning hours, but the coherent parts where Edward talked about his regrets, his love for her, his sorrow at the angry man he'd become after losing his wife. I watched her face as she listened to her father's impossible voice, speaking words he'd never found the courage to say in life. She cried, of course, but they were healing tears, the kind that come when a wound you didn't know you were carrying finally begins to close. When the recording ended, she kissed Edward's forehead and whispered, "I forgive you, Dad. I always forgave you." The next morning, when I arrived to prepare for the funeral service, Suite 12 was completely quiet. Edward's hands were positioned exactly as I'd originally placed them, folded peacefully over his chest. The scratches in the casket lining had somehow repaired themselves, the silk smooth and unmarked. The tape recorder was gone, as if it had never existed at all. But in Edward's jacket pocket, I found a handwritten note that hadn't been there before. "Thank you for listening, Daniel. I'm ready now." The funeral proceeded without incident, and Edward was laid to rest in the family plot beside his wife. But sometimes, when I'm working late in the preparation rooms, I hear the soft whir of a tape recorder running somewhere in the building. I've learned not to go looking for it. Some conversations between the living and the dead are meant to stay private, even when they happen in the space between one world and the next. I still talk to the people I work on, explaining each step of the process as I go, but now I listen too, just in case someone needs to tell me they're not ready yet, and needs my help finding the words to say goodbye. Rachel Price's casket was empty when we opened it, but her phone had been calling her mother every Tuesday at 3:15 for 8 months. I'm Maria Santos, and I've been a funeral director at Eternal Rest Memorial for 16 years. I've seen families destroyed by sudden loss, watched grief transform people into shadows of themselves, helped them find ways to say goodbye when goodbye feels impossible. But Rachel Price's case taught me that sometimes the dead refuse to let go as much as the living do, and that love can be stronger than the boundaries between life and death. Rachel was 26 when the car accident took her, a bright young teacher with her whole life ahead of her. The impact killed her instantly. According to the medical examiner, no suffering, no time to be afraid. Small comfort for her mother Linda, who had raised Rachel alone after her husband died when Rachel was just 8 years old. They were close, talking on the phone every day, sharing everything from work problems to recipe ideas. The funeral was heartbreaking, in the way that services for young people always are. Linda held herself together through the viewing and burial, but I could see the brittleness in her composure, the way grief was crystallizing into something sharp and unbending inside her chest. Rachel was buried at Maplewood Cemetery, in a pink casket she'd joked about wanting when she turned 21, surrounded by flowers from her elementary school students. I thought that would be the end of my involvement with the Price family, but Linda called me 3 weeks later. Her voice was shaky, uncertain, like someone questioning their own sanity. "Maria, this is going to sound crazy, but I've been getting phone calls from Rachel's number. I'd heard similar things before grief could play terrible tricks on the mind, make people see signs and hear voices where none existed. I asked Linda if she'd considered that maybe the phone company hadn't disconnected the line yet, that perhaps someone else had been assigned Rachel's number. No, I checked all that. The number was disconnected the day after the funeral. But every Tuesday at 3:15, my phone rings, and when I look at the caller ID, it shows Rachel's name and number. When I answer, there's no one there, just silence. But I can hear breathing, soft and slow, like she's trying to tell me something. I talked Linda through the practical possibilities: crossed wires, phone company errors, even the chance that someone was playing a cruel prank. But she was insistent that something more was happening, something that defied easy explanation. "She always called me on Tuesdays at 3:15, Linda said. That was her free period at school, and she'd use those 20 minutes to catch up with me about her week. It was our time, just the two of us. Maria, I think she's still trying to keep our appointment." The calls continued for months. Every Tuesday, 3:15 exactly, Rachel's number would appear on Linda's phone. Linda started recording the calls, hoping to capture something that would prove she wasn't losing her mind. The recordings were strange, long stretches of silence, punctuated by what sounded like someone trying to speak but unable to form words, breathing that seemed to carry the weight of tremendous effort. Linda's grief began to twist into something unhealthy, an obsession with those weekly calls that kept her from moving forward with her life. She stopped working, stopped seeing friends, spent her days waiting for Tuesday afternoons when her daughter would try to reach her from whatever place the dead inhabit. I visited her several times, concerned about her mental state, but she seemed lucid about everything except the phone calls. 8 months after Rachel's burial, Linda made a request that chilled me to the bone. She wanted her daughter exhumed. "I think Rachel's trying to tell me something important," she said. "Something she needs me to know before she can rest. Maybe there's something in her casket, something I missed when we buried her. I need to see her again, Maria. I need to understand why she's still calling." Exhumations are rare, requiring court orders and compelling reasons. Linda's request seemed to be driven entirely by grief-induced delusion, but she was persistent. She hired a lawyer, filed the necessary paperwork, claimed she suspected the funeral home had made an error in the burial process. It took 3 months, but eventually the court granted the order. We scheduled the exhumation for a Tuesday morning, and Linda insisted on being present despite my recommendations otherwise. I'd handled dozens of exhumations in my career, but something about this one felt different from the moment we broke ground. The air around Rachel's grave seemed heavier, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. When we lifted Rachel's casket and transported it back to the funeral home for examination, I noticed immediately that something was wrong with the weight distribution. The casket felt too light, as if it contained less than it should. Linda stood beside me as I prepared to open it, her face set with the kind of determination that comes from months of unanswered questions. The casket was empty. Not empty in the sense of being robbed or disturbed. Empty as if Rachel had simply vanished from inside her sealed resting place. Her burial clothes were folded neatly in the corner. The pink dress Linda had chosen, arranged as carefully as if someone had laid it out for laundry. Her jewelry was there. Her glasses, even the small teddy bear Linda had tucked into the casket at the last moment. But Rachel herself was gone. Linda stared into the empty casket for a long moment, then looked at me with eyes that held no surprise, only a terrible understanding. "She was never there, was she?" she said quietly. "She couldn't rest because she was still trying to reach me, still trying to keep our Tuesday appointments." I had no answer for her. In 16 years of funeral service, I'd never encountered anything like this. Bodies don't disappear from sealed caskets, buried 6 feet underground. But the evidence was undeniable. Rachel Price had somehow left her grave, though where she'd gone and how she'd managed it remained a mystery. That afternoon, as we were completing the paperwork for the investigation that would inevitably follow, Linda's phone rang. 3:15 exactly. Rachel's number, Rachel's name on the caller ID. But this time, instead of silence and breathing, there was a voice. "Mom, I'm sorry I worried you. I kept trying to tell you I was okay, that you didn't need to grieve so hard for me. I was stuck between where I was and where you needed me to be. But now that you know I'm not trapped in the ground, I can go where I'm supposed to go." Linda pressed the speakerphone button, and I heard Rachel's voice clearly, warm and loving and unmistakably hers. She talked for exactly 20 minutes, the length of a typical school-free period, telling her mother about the place she'd found herself after death, assuring her that she was happy and safe and surrounded by love. "I won't be calling anymore, Mom. Not because I don't love you, but because you need to live your life now. I'll be waiting for you when your time comes. But that won't be for many, many years. Promise me you'll start living again." The call ended, and Linda's phone showed no record of it ever happening. The call log was empty, as if the conversation had taken place in some space outside of normal reality. But Linda was transformed. The brittle grief replaced by a peaceful acceptance I hadn't seen in her since before the accident. We never found Rachel's body, though the investigation continued for months. The official explanation was grave robbery, though no one could explain how thieves had managed to remove a body from a sealed casket without disturbing the surrounding soil. The case remains unsolved in the police files, another unexplained mystery in a world full of them. Linda kept her promise to her daughter. She returned to work, started seeing friends again, began the slow process of building a life that included joy alongside her memories of loss. She never received another call from Rachel's number, but sometimes she'd smile at 3:15 on Tuesday afternoons, as if she could still feel the connection that had bound them together across the impossible distance between life and death. I sealed Rachel's empty casket and returned it to Maplewood Cemetery, where it rests beneath a headstone that bears her name and dates but holds no earthly remains. Sometimes, when I drive past the cemetery on Tuesday afternoons, I think about love that transcends death, about the promises we make to those we've lost, and about the phone calls that can bridge any distance when the need is great enough. And sometimes, just sometimes, I hear the faint sound of a phone ringing somewhere in the funeral home, calling across the void between worlds with a message of love that refuses to be silenced by something as small as death. We kept digging deeper in the Morrison plot and finding more caskets that weren't supposed to be there, 7 in total, each one holding a locket with the same woman's photograph. My name is Dale Murphy, and I've been foreman at Riverside Cemetery for 22 years. I know this place better than my own backyard. Every plot, every burial, every inch of the 140 acres we maintain. I can tell you the exact depth of groundwater in each section, which areas flood in spring rains, where the soil is too rocky for efficient digging. What I can't tell you is how 7 people buried themselves in a plot that was only supposed to hold 2, or why they all carried the same woman's picture into their graves. The Morrison plot was purchased in 1998 by Harold and Margaret Morrison, both in their 70s, planning ahead for their eventual passing. Standard double plot, side by side. In Section C, overlooking the pond, Harold died first, in 2001, and we buried him on the left side of their plot. Margaret followed 6 years later, and she joined him on the right side, just as they'd planned. The family called last month requesting expansion of the plot. Their son, Robert, had died unexpectedly, and they wanted to purchase the adjacent space to keep the family together. Simple request, happens all the time. But when I checked the cemetery database, I discovered that the adjacent plot was already occupied by someone named Jennifer Walsh, buried in 1986. That seemed like a clerical error. Our records sometimes got confused during the transition to digital files back in the early 2000s. I decided to do a test excavation to determine the actual boundaries of the Morrison plot before we made any commitments to the family about expansion possibilities. Tommy and Carl started digging Tuesday morning, using the plot markers as reference points. Standard procedure for boundary disputes: dig down until you hit caskets, measure the positions, update the records accordingly. We expected to find Harold and Margaret exactly where we'd left them, maybe some evidence of the Walsh burial if our measurements were off. Instead, we found Harold Morrison's casket 6 feet down, exactly where it should be. But when we expanded the excavation to check the boundaries, we found another casket directly beneath Harold's, then another one below that, and another. By Thursday afternoon, we'd uncovered 7 caskets stacked in the Morrison plot like boxes in a warehouse, each one buried deeper than the last. The deepest was maybe 14 feet down, well below the level where we'd ever conducted burials at Riverside. The names on the coffin plates read like a catalog of the missing: Jennifer Walsh, 1986, Michael Torres, 1991, Sandra Kim, 1994, David Brennan, 1997, Lisa Chang, 2003, Robert Sullivan, 2006. None of them were in our burial records. None of them had death certificates on file with the county. But all of them were real people who had vanished over the past 30 years, their disappearances investigated by police and eventually filed away as unsolved cases. The authorities took over the excavation site, treating it as a crime scene and potential mass grave. The forensics team worked carefully, documenting each burial, looking for evidence of foul play or murder. But what they found was even more disturbing than a serial killer's dumping ground. Each person had been buried with the same care and dignity we gave to our regular interments. Proper caskets, not cheap or makeshift containers. Bodies embalmed and dressed in formal clothing. Hands folded, faces peaceful, everything arranged as if these had been normal funerals with grieving families and proper ceremonies. But every single one of them had been buried with an identical locket, gold-plated, heart-shaped, with a small clasp that opened to reveal a black and white photograph of a woman. The same woman in every locket, young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair and a sad smile that seemed to look directly at whoever was viewing the picture. The photo appeared to be from the 1940s or 50s, based on the hairstyle and clothing, but it was in perfect condition in each locket, as if it had been taken yesterday. I recognized her face immediately. Margaret Morrison. Not Margaret as she'd been when we buried her at 83, but Margaret as a young woman decades before she'd met Harold, decades before she'd become the elderly widow who'd purchased this plot for her and her husband's final rest. The Margaret in the lockets was beautiful and haunting, with eyes that held secrets I was suddenly afraid to understand. The forensics investigation turned up more questions than answers. The missing persons had all disappeared within a 50-mile radius of Riverside Cemetery, spanning 3 decades, but with no apparent connection to each other. Jennifer Walsh was a college student who'd vanished walking home from a party. Michael Torres was a construction worker who'd left for a job one morning and never returned. Sandra Kim was a nurse who disappeared from the hospital parking garage after her shift. All different ages, backgrounds, circumstances. The only thing they had in common was that they'd all gone missing on the anniversary of Margaret Morrison's death, October 13th. I spent hours going through Margaret's file, trying to understand the connection between this elderly woman and 7 missing people. Her obituary was standard, mentioning her work as a secretary, her volunteer activities at the local library, her quiet life as a widow after Harold's passing. Nothing that suggested the kind of dark secrets that could explain what we'd found beneath her grave. But buried in the back of her file was a police report from 1952. Margaret Henley, as she'd been known then, had been questioned in connection with the disappearance of her roommate, Patricia Owens. Patricia had vanished from their shared apartment one night, leaving behind all her belongings and a note saying she'd decided to start a new life somewhere else. The police had accepted the explanation after a brief investigation, and Margaret had never been considered a serious suspect. The photograph in Patricia Owens' missing person file looked exactly like the woman in the lockets. I brought this information to the detective handling the case, watched his face grow pale as he compared the old police photo with the locket pictures. Margaret Morrison had been carrying Patricia Owens' image for over 60 years, and somehow she'd arranged for 7 other people to carry it with them into their graves. The detective reopened Patricia's case, but there wasn't much to investigate after so many decades. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no way to prove what had really happened in that apartment in 1952. But I had my own theory, one that explained the careful burials, the identical lockets, the pattern of disappearances that had continued long after Margaret should have been too old and frail to harm anyone. Margaret had loved Patricia Owens, and Patricia had tried to leave. Maybe it was a romantic love that couldn't be expressed in 1952. Maybe it was obsession. Maybe it was something darker that I didn't want to contemplate. But Margaret had made sure Patricia couldn't abandon her, had kept her close in the only way she could. And when Margaret died, the pattern had continued. People who resembled Patricia, people who might have understood the kind of loneliness that could drive someone to murder, had been drawn to Margaret's grave on the anniversary of her death, drawn down into the earth where they could keep her company, where they could carry Patricia's picture in their hearts, just as Margaret had for 60 years. We reburied the 7 unregistered bodies in individual plots, holding proper services for each of them, finally giving their families the closure they'd been seeking for decades. But we left Margaret Morrison exactly where she was, because moving her seemed like asking for trouble we weren't prepared to handle. I still walk past the Morrison plot every day during my rounds, and I always feel like I'm being watched from beneath the ground. The soil over Margaret's grave never quite settles properly, as if something underneath is still shifting, still arranging itself for whatever comes next. Last month, on the anniversary of Margaret's death, I found fresh flowers on her grave, white lilies tied with a black ribbon, the kind of arrangement you'd bring to remember someone who died young and tragically. There was no card, no indication of who'd left them, but I recognized the style from funeral arrangements we'd used in the 1950s. I didn't remove the flowers. Some vigils are meant to continue, and some love is too strong to be buried, even 14 feet underground. I just made a note in my daily log and continued my rounds, listening for sounds that might come from beneath the earth, watching for shadows that moved without casting objects to explain them. Because I've learned that the dead don't always stay where we put them, and sometimes the deepest graves are the ones that hold the deepest secrets. Fresh white roses appeared inside Walter Thompson's sealed casket every week for 2 years, but his wife had been in a coma since the month after his funeral. I'm Kim Patterson, and I've been directing funerals at Serenity Memorial for 18 years. I've learned that grief expresses itself in countless ways. Some families need elaborate services, others prefer simple ceremonies, and a few require the kind of ongoing support that extends far beyond the burial date. But Diane Thompson's devotion to her husband transcended anything I'd encountered in my career, creating a mystery that challenged everything I thought I understood about love, loss, and the boundaries between life and death. Walter Thompson was 74 when the stroke took him, a retired electrician who'd spent 47 years married to the same woman. Diane was with him when he died, holding his hand in the hospital room, whispering promises that she'd take care of everything just the way he would have wanted. Their love was the kind that made you believe in soulmates, complete, devoted, unshakable even in the face of death. The funeral was exactly what Walter would have chosen. Simple service, oak casket, burial in Restwood Cemetery, beside the plot Diane had reserved for herself. She insisted on white roses for the arrangements because they were the flowers he'd brought her every Friday for their entire marriage. I helped her select the casket spray, a beautiful cascade of white roses that would rest on the casket during the service and be buried with him. Diane held herself together during the funeral, with the kind of strength that comes from deep faith, but I could see the devastation in her eyes. Losing a partner after nearly 5 decades of marriage is like losing half of your soul, and I knew she'd need time to find her footing in a world without Walter's steady presence. 3 weeks after the funeral, Diane was driving home from grocery shopping when she suffered a massive stroke at the wheel. Her car drifted into a tree at low speed. She was lucky to survive, but the oxygen deprivation left her in a coma that doctors said was unlikely to be reversed. She was moved to St. Catherine's long-term care facility, where she lay connected to machines that breathed for her and monitored her vital signs. I visited Diane several times during the first month, sitting beside her bed and reading aloud from the sympathy cards that continued to arrive. The doctors said coma patients could sometimes hear familiar voices, that it might help with their recovery. I didn't know if that was true, but it seemed like something Walter would have wanted me to do for his wife. The flowers started appearing 6 weeks after Walter's burial. Jerry Kowalski, the groundskeeper at Restwood Cemetery, called me on a Tuesday morning with a question that left me speechless. "Kim, I need to ask you about the Thompson plot. Are you folks still maintaining weekly flower deliveries?" I checked Walter's file, but there was no ongoing arrangement for fresh flowers. The family had specifically requested that the casket spray be buried with him rather than displayed at the graveside, and Diane hadn't made any provisions for continuing floral tributes. "What kind of flowers are you seeing, Jerry?" "White roses. Same arrangement every week, placed right on top of the grave. Real fresh ones too, like they were just delivered." I figured maybe the funeral home was handling it as a courtesy service. I drove out to Restwood that afternoon to see for myself. Sure enough, there was a beautiful arrangement of white roses on Walter's grave, 12 stems tied with a white satin ribbon, placed precisely in the center of the headstone. They looked like they'd been cut that morning, petals still perfect, no signs of wilting despite being exposed to October weather. Jerry showed me his weekly maintenance logs. Every Tuesday for the past month, he'd found fresh white roses on Walter's grave. Every Monday night, he'd lock the cemetery gates and patrol the grounds as usual, no flowers. Every Tuesday morning, the arrangement would be there, as if it had materialized overnight. "I thought maybe it was family," Jerry said. "But I checked with the front office, and nobody's purchased flowers or made special arrangements. These just appear." I called the local florists, thinking maybe Diane had set up automatic deliveries before her stroke. But none of them had any record of orders for Walter Thompson's grave, and the roses didn't match any of their standard arrangements. The ribbon was hand-tied, the stems cut at angles that suggested professional skill, but the style was distinctive, not like anything the commercial flower shops produced. The mystery deepened when I decided to visit St. Catherine's to ask the nursing staff about Diane's condition. Her primary care nurse, a kind woman named Sarah, showed me to Diane's room where she lay surrounded by the mechanical sounds of life support equipment. "Has she had any visitors recently?" I asked. "Anyone who might be handling affairs for the family?" Sarah shook her head. "Mrs. Thompson hasn't had visitors since you stopped coming last month. Her condition hasn't changed, no response to stimuli, no sign of consciousness. The doctors don't expect any improvement. But as we stood talking beside Diane's bed, I noticed something that made my hands tremble. On the bedside table, in a small glass vase, was a single white rose, fresh, perfect, identical to the ones appearing at Walter's grave. Where did that flower come from? Sarah looked confused. I'm not sure. The staff doesn't provide flowers for patients, and Mrs. Thompson hasn't had any deliveries. I just assumed. I mean, it's been there every week since she arrived. I thought maybe the family had arranged it somehow. I learned that the rose appeared every Tuesday, the same day fresh arrangements materialized at Walter's grave. The nursing staff had grown used to finding it there, assuming it was part of some automated service they didn't understand. But when I checked with the hospital administration, there was no record of flower deliveries or special arrangements for Diane Thompson's room. This pattern continued for 2 years. Every Tuesday, without fail, white roses appeared at Walter's grave, and a single rose materialized beside Diane's bed. I started documenting the appearances, taking photographs, trying to catch whoever was responsible for what seemed like an impossible feat of devotion. I installed motion-activated cameras at Walter's grave, hoping to identify the person leaving the flowers. The cameras showed empty cemetery grounds on Monday night, then recorded an arrangement appearing sometime between midnight and dawn on Tuesday, but they never captured anyone placing it there. The roses simply manifested in the frame, as if they'd grown from the earth itself. The breakthrough came during my routine visit to check on Walter's burial vault. The cemetery required annual inspections of sealed burials to ensure structural integrity, and Walter's 2-year anniversary was approaching. When we opened the vault to examine the casket, I discovered something that defied every law of physics and biology I understood. The casket was filled with white roses. Not just the original spray we'd buried with Walter, hundreds of roses, packed around his body like a garden that had somehow bloomed in the darkness of his grave. They were all fresh, all perfect, creating a bed of white petals that cushioned Walter's remains as if he were sleeping in the most beautiful garden ever created. The roses weren't decaying. They weren't even wilting. They looked like they'd been picked that morning and arranged by someone who understood exactly how Walter would want to spend eternity, surrounded by the flowers that had symbolized his love for Diane every Friday for 47 years. I stood beside that open casket for an hour, trying to process what I was seeing. The roses had no source, no explanation, no rational cause. They appeared to be materializing from the love between Walter and Diane, manifesting physically in the space where their devotion transcended the boundaries between life and death. That night, I drove to St. Catherine's and sat beside Diane's bed, studying her peaceful face for any sign of consciousness. The single white rose was there as always, fresh and perfect in its glass vase. On impulse, I took her hand and spoke to her as if she could hear me. Diane, it's Kim from the funeral home. I need you to know that Walter is surrounded by roses, hundreds of them, all white, just like the ones he brought you. I think somehow you're still taking care of him, still making sure he has flowers every week. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Her hand squeezed mine, just once, just barely perceptible but unmistakably deliberate. The roses continued appearing at Walter's grave every Tuesday, and I never tried to solve the mystery again. Some expressions of love are too perfect to analyze, too pure to question. I simply documented their appearance in my records and made sure the cemetery staff understood that this was not a service we provided. It was something much more rare and precious than any funeral arrangement I could create. Diane passed away 3 years later, still in her coma, never having spoken another word. But on the day of her funeral, when we opened Walter's casket to place her beside him, the roses had arranged themselves into a perfect bed for two, creating space for his wife in their eternal garden of white blooms. They're buried together now in Restwood Cemetery, and fresh white roses still appear on their shared grave every Tuesday. Jerry stopped questioning their source years ago, just includes them in his maintenance rounds as part of the landscape that makes Restwood the most beautiful cemetery in the county. Because some love stories don't end with death, they just find new ways to bloom in the darkness, creating beauty in places where beauty should be impossible, proving that devotion can transcend any boundary the world tries to place between two souls who belong together. When we exhumed Robert Watson, his hands were folded over a newspaper dated 3 days after his death, with corrections to his obituary written in red ink. I'm David Chen, and I've been an embalmer at Willowbrook Funeral Services for 24 years. My work requires precision, attention to detail, and respect for the final wishes of both the deceased and their families. I take pride in ensuring that every person who passes through my preparation room is treated with dignity, positioned exactly as their loved ones remember them, prepared for a farewell that honors their life. But Robert Watson taught me that some people refuse to accept the story. Others write about their death, even when they're no longer alive to argue their case. Robert came to us in February, 79 years old, died of complications from pneumonia, according to his medical records. He'd been a newspaper editor for most of his professional life, working at the local Herald for 37 years before retiring. His daughter Carol made the arrangements. She wanted a traditional service, viewing for 2 days, burial in Greenwood Cemetery, where her mother was already interred. The obituary Carol provided painted Robert as a loving father and devoted community servant, a man who dedicated his life to honest journalism and family values. She'd written it herself, with help from Robert's former colleagues at the Herald, and it read like the kind of tribute any family would be proud to publish. Nothing controversial, nothing that suggested Robert Watson had lived anything but an exemplary life. I embalmed Robert with my usual care, positioned him in the navy suit Carol had selected, folded his hands across his chest in the traditional pose. His face had the peaceful expression that comes with a life well lived and a natural death. Everything was routine, everything exactly as it should be for a respected member of the community saying his final goodbye. The viewing went smoothly. Maybe 60 people came to pay their respects, former co-workers, neighbors, members of his church. Carol received condolences with the composure of someone who'd had time to prepare for this loss, and the service proceeded with the dignity Robert's life and career had earned. I monitored everything from the background, ensuring the flowers stayed fresh and the viewing room maintained the proper atmosphere of reverence. Robert was buried on a Thursday morning in a simple graveside ceremony. I watched as his casket was lowered into the ground, saw Carol throw a handful of earth onto the mahogany surface, observed the final prayers that would send Robert Watson to his eternal rest. Standard procedure, completed according to protocol. 18 months later, Carol requested an exhumation. She'd decided to move her parents to a family plot in Ohio where she'd relocated for work, wanted to keep the family together even in death. Nothing unusual about the request. Families move across the country all the time, and taking their loved ones with them has become increasingly common. We scheduled the exhumation for early morning, when the cemetery would be quiet and we could work without disturbing other visitors. The excavation went smoothly, and Robert's casket was in excellent condition when we lifted it from the grave. I expected to find him exactly as I'd left him 18 months earlier. Hands folded, suit neat, expression peaceful. Instead, I found Robert Watson clutching a copy of the Herald, dated 3 days after his death. The newspaper was folded open to the obituary page, to his own obituary that Carol had written with such care. But someone had been editing it with red ink, making corrections and additions in handwriting I recognized from the documents Carol had shown me during the original funeral arrangements. Robert's handwriting, distinctive and precise from decades of editing other people's words. The corrections were extensive. Where Carol had written about Robert's devotion to honest journalism, he'd crossed out honest and written convenient in red ink. Where she'd described him as a loving father, he'd added, when it suited his career in the margin. The phrase, respected member of the community, had been changed to protected the powerful at the expense of truth. But the most disturbing additions were at the bottom of the obituary, where Robert had apparently written his own postscript in that same red ink. The stories I buried were more important than the ones I published. Ask my daughter about the Riverside development scandal. Ask her why certain city council members never faced investigation. Ask her why I kept 40 years of documents in the basement safe, and why she burned them the day after my funeral without reading what they contained. I stared at that newspaper for a long moment, trying to process what I was seeing. Robert's hands, which I'd positioned in the standard funeral pose, were now gripped around the paper as if he'd been holding it when rigor mortis set in. His expression, peaceful when I'd last seen him, now showed the kind of determination that comes from unfinished business. The newspaper itself was impossible. The Herald, from 3 days after Robert's death. I remembered reading his obituary in that exact edition. Remembered thinking Carol had done a beautiful job honoring her father's memory. But this copy contained corrections that hadn't been there before, written in ink that looked fresh, despite being buried underground for a year and a half. When I showed Carol the newspaper that afternoon, her face went pale. She read the corrections silently, her hands shaking as she took in her father's posthumous editing of his own life story. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Where did this come from? How could he have... he's been dead for 18 months. I had no answer for her, but I could see in her eyes that the corrections weren't entirely unexpected. Something in her expression suggested that Robert's red ink editions contained more truth than the sanitized version she'd published. "Carol, what was the Riverside development scandal?" She closed the newspaper carefully, as if folding away secrets she'd hoped would stay buried with her father. Something that happened in the 1980s. Dad was investigating corruption in the city planning office, kickbacks and zoning variances that were making certain developers very wealthy. He had sources, documents, enough evidence to bring down half the city council. But he never published the story? No. One day he just stopped working on it, said he'd been mistaken, that there wasn't enough evidence to proceed. But I found boxes of files in his basement after the funeral, documents that proved everything he'd suspected. Phone records, bank statements, recorded conversations, enough to rewrite the history of this town. "What did you do with them?" Carol looked away. "I burned them, I thought. I thought it would be better to let sleeping dogs lie. Dad had made his choice not to publish the story, and I didn't want to damage his reputation by suggesting he'd been involved in some kind of cover-up." But Robert's red ink corrections told a different story. He hadn't abandoned the investigation by choice. He'd been pressured to kill it, threatened or bought off by the same powerful interests he'd spent his career protecting instead of exposing. And in death, he was trying to set the record straight, trying to reclaim the integrity that had been compromised in life. Over the following weeks, Carol began having dreams about her father. She'd find him sitting at his old desk in the Herald newsroom, working late into the night on stories that would never be published, typing corrections to articles that had already gone to print decades earlier. In the dreams, he'd look up at her with eyes full of regret and say, "I let them silence me in life, Carol. Don't let them silence me in death." She started researching the Riverside development scandal on her own, using the public records that were still available, and interviewing retired city employees who remembered the investigations that had mysteriously disappeared. What she uncovered was exactly what Robert's hidden files had contained: a web of corruption that had shaped the town's development for decades. Carol published her findings in a series of articles for the Herald's online edition, crediting her father's original investigation and honoring the journalist he should have been allowed to be. The articles created a sensation, led to a grand jury investigation, and ultimately resulted in several indictments for historical corruption charges. But the most important correction came in the form of a revised obituary that Carol published exactly 2 years after her father's death. This version told the truth about Robert Watson, a journalist who had discovered important stories but had been prevented from telling them. A man who had spent his final years regretting the compromises he'd made. A father who had left his daughter the tools she needed to finish the work he'd been forced to abandon. When we reburied Robert Watson in Ohio, I made sure his hands were positioned exactly as I'd found them during the exhumation, still holding that impossible newspaper with its red ink corrections. Because some stories are too important to stay buried, and some truths refuse to accept the sanitized versions that others write about them. I still keep a copy of both obituaries in Robert's file, the original that painted him as a pillar of the community, and the revised version that revealed him as something more complex and ultimately more human. Sometimes, late at night when I'm working in the preparation room, I think about the stories we tell about the dead and wonder how many of them are waiting to be corrected by hands that can no longer hold pens but refuse to let lies define their legacy. Because death might end a journalist's career, but apparently it can't stop someone from editing the final draft of their own life story. Beneath Mrs. Patterson's grave, we found a man in a 1950s suit holding a love letter, and her granddaughter recognized the handwriting of someone who'd supposedly died waiting for her grandmother to leave her husband. I'm Anna Kowalski, and I've been maintaining the grounds at Elmwood Cemetery for 17 years. Every headstone tells a story. Every plot holds memories of lives lived and loved ones left behind. I know which graves get regular visitors, which flowers last longest in different seasons, and how to read the subtle signs of a cemetery that's more than just a resting place for the dead. But Eleanor Patterson's grave taught me that some love stories span decades and defy every boundary we think separates the living from the dead. Eleanor Patterson was buried on a rainy Thursday in April, 91 years old, and surrounded by 3 generations of family who'd gathered to say goodbye to their beloved matriarch. She'd lived in the same house for 70 years, raised 4 children, buried her husband Henry in 1998, and become the kind of grandmother whose kitchen table was the center of family gatherings, and whose wisdom guided everyone from toddlers to great-grandchildren. The funeral was exactly what Eleanor would have wanted. Simple, dignified, filled with stories about her kindness and the quiet strength that had held her family together through decades of joy and sorrow. I helped coordinate the graveside service, ensuring the flowers were arranged properly, and the cemetery grounds looked their best for Eleanor's final farewell. Her plot was in Section 7, beneath an old maple tree that provided shade for a dozen other graves. Eleanor had chosen the location herself, wanting to rest somewhere peaceful where families could visit without feeling overwhelmed by sadness. It was a good choice. Section 7 had a gentle beauty that made grief feel less sharp, more like the natural conclusion of a life well lived. 6 months after Eleanor's burial, her family requested relocation. Eleanor's youngest daughter had moved to Arizona for health reasons, and the family wanted to transfer Eleanor's remains to a cemetery in Phoenix, where they could all visit more easily. Standard request, the kind of thing we handle several times each year when families are scattered by circumstances beyond their control. I scheduled the exhumation for early November, when the cemetery would be quiet and we could work without disturbing visitors coming for Memorial Day observances. The excavation team arrived at dawn, and we began the careful process of uncovering Eleanor's casket from its resting place beneath the maple tree. But when we reached the depth where Eleanor should have been buried, we found something unexpected. Her casket was there, perfectly preserved and positioned exactly as we'd left it. But directly beneath it, maybe 2 feet deeper, was another casket that wasn't in any of our burial records. The second casket was older, made of wood that had darkened with age but remained structurally sound. The nameplate was tarnished, but readable. James Michael Sullivan, 1954. The date meant he'd been buried the same year Eleanor's oldest grandchild was born. Decades before Elmwood Cemetery had started using that section for interments. I checked our historical records, but there was no documentation of any burial named Sullivan in Section 7. Our database went back to the cemetery's founding in 1895, and James Sullivan simply didn't exist in any official capacity. Yet here he was, buried in a grave that predated our use of that plot, somehow positioned directly beneath where Eleanor would eventually be interred. We called the county coroner, treating it as a potential archaeological discovery or unmarked historical grave. But when the forensics team opened Sullivan's casket, they found something that transformed the situation from bureaucratic confusion into a mystery that challenged everything I understood about coincidence and fate. James Sullivan had been a young man when he died, maybe 30 years old, dressed in a navy suit that was perfectly preserved despite being buried for over 60 years. His face was peaceful, hands folded over his chest, everything arranged as if he'd been expecting to wait a very long time for something important to happen. But clutched in his hands was an envelope, yellowed with age but sealed and intact. Written on the front in careful cursive was, "For my dearest Eleanor, when you're finally ready to hear the truth." The letter inside was a confession of love that spanned 5 handwritten pages, dated October 3rd, 1954, just 2 weeks before James Sullivan's recorded death from tuberculosis. He wrote about meeting Eleanor Henley at a church social, falling in love with her kindness and gentle spirit, planning to ask her father for permission to court her properly. But Eleanor was already engaged to Henry Patterson, a practical match, arranged by their families and blessed by the community. James wrote about watching her prepare for a wedding that would take her away from him forever, about his decision to keep his feelings secret rather than complicate her life with declarations that could only cause pain. "I'm dying, Eleanor," the letter concluded, "and I don't have much time left to tell you what you've meant to me. I know you'll marry Henry and live the good life you deserve, have children and grandchildren who'll love you the way I never got the chance to. But I want you to know that in whatever time I have left, in whatever comes after, I'll be waiting for you, not to complicate your happiness, just to love you the way you were meant to be loved, completely and forever." The letter was signed "Your devoted James" and included a small photograph of him in his church clothes, standing beside a 1950 Chevrolet with a hopeful smile that suggested he'd believed love could conquer any obstacle fate placed in its path. When I called Eleanor's family to report the discovery, her granddaughter Sarah agreed to come identify the letter and photograph. I expected confusion, maybe skepticism about the connection between this mysterious burial and their grandmother. Instead, Sarah took one look at James Sullivan's photograph and burst into tears. "Grandma kept this picture in her Bible for 70 years, she said through her sobs. She never told anyone who he was, just said he was a good friend who died young. But sometimes, late at night when she thought no one was listening, I'd hear her talking to his picture, telling him about her day, asking him if he thought she'd made the right choices." Sarah revealed that Eleanor had spoken about James Sullivan only once, during her final illness, when the medications had lowered her usual reserve. She told Sarah about a young man who'd loved her before she married Henry, someone who died before he could tell her how he felt. Eleanor had wondered, in those fading moments of clarity, what might have been different if she'd known about his feelings, if she'd had the chance to choose love over security. "She said she dreamed about him sometimes," Sarah continued, "especially after Grandpa died. Dreams where they were young again, where she got to tell him all the things she'd never had the chance to say. She'd wake up crying, but also smiling, as if those dreams were visits instead of just memories." We reburied James Sullivan in a plot adjacent to Eleanor's, finally giving him the proximity to her that death had denied him for over 60 years. But first, Sarah made a decision that honored both the love James had carried in silence and the regret Eleanor had held in her heart. She placed James's letter in Eleanor's casket, folding it into her grandmother's hands so she could finally read the words she'd never received in life. And she included a response, written in Eleanor's handwriting, from a journal Sarah had found after the funeral pages, where Eleanor had written unsent letters to the boy who loved me before I knew what love meant. When we transferred Eleanor's remains to Arizona, Sarah decided to move James Sullivan as well, purchasing adjacent plots so they could continue their posthumous companionship in ground that had no history of separation or silence. The cemetery in Phoenix created a small garden around their graves, with a bench where Sarah could sit and tell them both about the family Eleanor had raised and the love story that had finally found its resolution after 7 decades of waiting. I still think about James Sullivan sometimes, about the young man who'd chosen to wait beneath the earth for a woman who'd never known he was there. His love had been patient enough to span 60 years, devoted enough to orchestrate a reunion that defied every law of coincidence and probability. Because true love doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to be patient, new ways to hope, new ways to ensure that someday, somehow, two hearts that were meant to be together will finally get their chance to beat in unison, even if it takes a lifetime and more to make that moment possible. The infrared camera showed a heat signature sitting upright in Henderson's casket for 37 minutes while we worked above ground, but when we opened it the next morning, his body was positioned like he'd been having a conversation. I'm Mike Rodriguez, and I've worked security at Peaceful Valley Cemetery for 11 years. Night shift, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 days a week. Most people think cemetery security is quiet work, maybe boring. But I've learned that the hours between sunset and sunrise reveal things about the dead that daylight never shows. The infrared cameras pick up more than just rabbits and deer. Sometimes they capture the kind of activity that makes you question everything you thought you knew about what happens after we stop breathing. The Henderson exhumation was scheduled for Thursday morning, standard family relocation request. Robert Henderson had been buried 8 months earlier after a heart attack, and his daughter wanted to move him to a veterans cemetery where he could rest among other servicemen. Simple procedure, the kind of thing we handle routinely without expecting complications. I'd been monitoring the Henderson plot on my security rounds since the family first requested the exhumation. Cemetery regulations require us to watch for any unauthorized activity around graves scheduled for disturbance, vandalism, theft, people trying to beat us to whatever they think might be valuable in the caskets. Standard precaution? Nothing unusual about the surveillance. But 3 nights before the scheduled exhumation, my infrared cameras started picking up anomalous heat signatures around Henderson's grave. The first incident happened at 11:47 p.m. on Monday. I was making my rounds when the motion detector for Section C activated, indicating movement near Henderson's plot. I checked the live feed and saw what looked like a person-sized heat signature positioned directly over the grave, but the visible light cameras showed nothing but empty grass and the standard granite headstone. Infrared cameras detect body heat, not visible shapes, so I figured maybe it was equipment malfunction or environmental factors creating false readings. But the signature was perfect human-shaped, human-sized, maintaining consistent temperature patterns for exactly 23 minutes before fading away. Tuesday night, the same thing happened. 11:47 p.m. exactly, the motion detector activated, and the infrared showed a heat signature sitting on Henderson's grave like someone keeping vigil. This time, I drove out to Section C to investigate personally, but when I arrived, the area was empty. No signs of disturbance, no footprints in the soft earth, nothing to explain what the cameras had recorded. But the infrared signature was still there when I checked the monitor in my vehicle, showing someone sitting maybe 6 feet from where I was standing, completely invisible to my eyes, but radiating body heat like any living person. Wednesday night, I positioned myself in Section C before 11:30, determined to solve the mystery. I brought night vision goggles, infrared thermometer, even a digital camera with high sensitivity settings. Everything was quiet until 11:47 exactly, when the motion detector chimed and my equipment went crazy. The infrared thermometer detected a heat source sitting directly on Henderson's grave, but I could see nothing with the night vision goggles. The digital camera showed empty ground through the viewfinder, but when I developed the pictures later, several frames contained a faint outline, the suggestion of a figure in military dress uniform sitting with perfect posture, like someone waiting for orders. Thursday morning arrived with the exhumation team, and I briefed the site supervisor about the unusual surveillance readings. He listened politely but clearly thought I'd been spending too many nights alone with electronic equipment that was prone to false alarms. Fair enough, I probably wouldn't have believed me either. The excavation proceeded normally until they reached Henderson's casket. When they lifted it from the grave and transported it to the preparation area for inspection, I noticed immediately that something had changed about the infrared readings. The heat signatures that had appeared every night for 3 days were now centered on the casket itself instead of the empty grave. I convinced the supervisor to let me set up surveillance equipment in the preparation building, claiming I needed to monitor for security purposes while the casket was unsealed. What I really wanted was to understand what my cameras had been showing me, to get some kind of explanation for the impossible heat signatures that defied everything I knew about physics and death. That afternoon, while the family was completing paperwork and the exhumation team was taking a lunch break, my infrared camera captured something that still gives me nightmares. The casket was sitting on a hydraulic table in the center of the preparation room, sealed and undisturbed. But according to the infrared feed, Robert Henderson was sitting upright inside it, radiating body heat like a living person. The signature was perfectly clear: head, torso, arms, everything positioned as if he were awake and alert, despite being dead for 8 months and sealed inside a mahogany box. For 37 minutes, the infrared showed Henderson maintaining that upright position, not moving around, not struggling, just sitting quietly, as if he were waiting for something or someone. Then, at exactly 3:24 p.m., the heat signature changed. Instead of sitting upright, it showed Henderson turning his head to the right, as if someone had entered the room and he was acknowledging their presence. But the room was empty. I was watching through the security monitors, and no one had entered the preparation building. The doors were locked, the windows were sealed, and I would have seen anyone approaching the facility from any direction. The infrared continued showing Henderson in conversation position for another 20 minutes, head turned, posture relaxed. The kind of body language you'd expect from someone engaged in friendly dialogue. Then the heat signature gradually faded, returning to the flat, cold reading you'd expect from a dead body in a sealed casket. When the family arrived to witness the casket opening for transfer verification, I positioned myself where I could observe both the procedure and their reactions. The funeral director unsealed Henderson's casket with the usual professional care, preparing to confirm the body's condition for the move to the veterans' cemetery. Robert Henderson was perfectly preserved, exactly as he should have been after 8 months of burial. But his position was completely wrong. Instead of lying flat with his hands folded over his chest in the traditional funeral pose, Henderson was positioned as if he'd been sitting up and then reclined, his head turned to the right, his arms relaxed at his sides. His expression was peaceful but alert, as if he'd just finished a conversation and was resting contentedly. Henderson's daughter noticed the positioning immediately. "That's not how Dad was lying during the viewing," she said, confusion clear in her voice. "His hands were folded and he was looking straight up. Why would he be turned like that?" The funeral director had no explanation. Bodies don't reposition themselves in sealed caskets, especially not in ways that suggest conscious movement. But Henderson's daughter recognized something in his posture that the funeral director couldn't see. "He's lying exactly the way he used to when Mom was alive," she said quietly. When they'd watch television together in the evenings, Dad would recline in his chair and turn toward the couch where Mom always Saturday. That's his listening position, the way he'd look when she was telling him about her day. She paused, studying her father's face more carefully. "Mom died 2 years before Dad did. He always said he felt her presence in the house, that she'd sit beside him in the evenings just like old times. We thought it was just grief, wishful thinking. But maybe she didn't finish the thought. But I understood what she was considering. Maybe Robert Henderson had been having visits from his wife during those 3 nights before the exhumation. Maybe the heat signatures my infrared cameras had recorded weren't malfunctions or environmental anomalies. Maybe they were evidence of a reunion that transcended the boundaries between life and death. When we transferred Henderson's casket to the Veterans Cemetery, his daughter made a special request. She wanted him buried beside a reserved plot where she planned to inter her mother's remains, which had been cremated and kept in an urn on the mantelpiece for 2 years. If they've been visiting each other, she explained, they should be able to continue. Mom always said she'd wait for Dad, and maybe she has been. Maybe they both have been waiting for the right time to be together again. That night, my final shift before the Henderson case was officially closed, the infrared cameras at Peaceful Valley Cemetery recorded no anomalous heat signatures. Section C remained quiet, with only the normal readings from nocturnal wildlife and environmental factors. Whatever vigil had been kept at Robert Henderson's grave had apparently concluded with his relocation. But sometimes, during my rounds through the newer sections of the cemetery, I catch glimpses of heat signatures that don't quite match the visible world. Couples sitting together on graves, families gathering around headstones, solitary figures keeping watch over plots where their loved ones rest. I don't report these sightings anymore. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some reunions are too precious to document in official security logs. I just make note of the locations, check them for any signs of vandalism or disturbance, and let the dead have their privacy. When they need time to talk to each other about the things that matter most, forgiveness, and the promises that death can never break. 17 wedding rings were sewn into Margaret Blackwood's casket lining, each engraved with names that matched missing wives from the past decade. But when we tried to question her husband about them, neighbors said his house had been empty for 3 years. I'm Grace Sullivan, and I've been a mortician at Riverside Funeral Home for 26 years. My work involves more than just preparing bodies for burial. I'm often the person families trust with their most precious memories, the keeper of final wishes and secret regrets. I've learned to read the stories that bodies tell, to notice details that others might overlook, and to handle discoveries that challenge everything we think we know about the people we lay to rest. But Margaret Blackwood's case revealed secrets so dark that I sometimes wonder if some knowledge is too dangerous to uncover, even in death. Margaret Blackwood died on a Tuesday evening in November, 83 years old, found peacefully in her bed by a neighbor who'd become concerned when she didn't answer her door for several days. Natural causes, according to the medical examiner, the kind of quiet passing that comes at the end of a long life. Her husband Harold made the arrangements, requesting a simple service with burial in Elmwood Cemetery, where they'd reserved adjacent plots years earlier. Harold seemed like a devoted husband, maybe 75 years old, soft-spoken and clearly grieving the loss of his partner of 54 years. He chose a beautiful mahogany casket for Margaret, selected her favorite blue dress for the burial, and insisted on the finest silk lining available. He wanted everything perfect for his wife's final rest, sparing no expense to ensure her comfort in death. I began Margaret's preparation with the usual attention to detail, embalming her carefully and positioning her in the dress Harold had provided. She'd been a small woman in life, maybe 5'2", with gentle features that spoke of a quiet, domestic existence. Everything seemed routine until I began arranging the casket interior for the viewing. The silk lining felt wrong beneath my hands. Instead of the smooth, uniform texture I expected, there were bumps and irregularities along the sides, as if small objects had been sewn into the fabric. I assumed it was a manufacturing defect, maybe poor quality control that had allowed foreign materials into the lining during production. But when I examined the irregularities more closely, I realized They were intentional. 17 small ring-shaped objects had been carefully stitched into the casket lining, positioned along the sides where they wouldn't be visible during the viewing, but would remain with Margaret throughout eternity. Someone had spent considerable time and effort to hide these objects where they'd never be discovered under normal circumstances. I should have called Harold immediately, asked him about the objects and whether they held special significance for Margaret, but something about the way they'd been concealed made me hesitate. This wasn't the kind of sentimental gesture families usually made, hiding grandmother's jewelry or father's watch in the casket lining. This felt deliberate, secretive, potentially sinister. I carefully cut open a small section of the lining and extracted one of the objects. It was a wedding ring, gold, with an inscription on the inside, "To Jennifer, my eternal love, David." The ring was well worn, the kind that comes from years of daily wear, but it wasn't Margaret's wedding ring. I'd already placed Margaret's ring on her finger, a simple band that matched the one Harold still wore. Curiosity overcame professional protocol. I extracted all 17 rings from the casket lining, laying them out on my workstation like evidence from a crime scene. Each ring was unique, different sizes and styles, but all were women's wedding bands with inscriptions that suggested long, devoted marriages. To Sarah, forever yours, Michael. To Lisa, my heart, my soul, Robert. To Catherine, until death do us part, Thomas. 17 rings, 17 women's names, 17 promises of eternal love. But none of the rings belonged to Margaret Blackwood, and none of the men's names inscribed inside matched Harold's. I photographed each ring and its inscription, then spent my lunch break researching the names online. What I discovered made my hands shake as I read through missing persons reports and cold case files that stretched back over a decade. Jennifer Morrison, reported missing in 2012, last seen leaving her job at the county library. David Morrison had been questioned extensively but never charged, claiming his wife had simply left him for another man. Sarah Chen disappeared in 2014 while walking her dog in the neighborhood where she'd lived for 20 years. Her husband Michael told police she'd been talking about visiting relatives in California, though no relatives could be located. Lisa Rodriguez vanished in 2016 from the grocery store parking lot where her car was found with her purse still inside. Robert Rodriguez appeared on local television, pleading for information about his missing wife, offering a substantial reward for her safe return. All 17 names matched missing women whose disappearances had been investigated but never solved. All 17 had husbands who'd provided alibis and alternative explanations for their wives' sudden absence from their lives. And somehow, all 17 wedding rings had ended up sewn into Margaret Blackwood's casket lining. I called the police, but explaining the situation proved more complex than I'd anticipated. Detective Martinez listened patiently as I described finding the rings, but her questions quickly revealed the central mystery. How had Margaret Blackwood obtained 17 wedding rings from missing women? And why had someone gone to such elaborate lengths to bury them with her? "We'll need to question Harold Blackwood immediately," Detective Martinez said. "These rings could be evidence in multiple homicide investigations. If his wife was involved in these disappearances, or if he was using her burial as a way to dispose of evidence." But when Detective Martinez and her partner arrived at the Blackwood address, they found the house empty, not recently vacated, but long abandoned. The electricity had been shut off 3 years earlier for non-payment. The mailbox was stuffed with undelivered mail dating back to 2020, and neighbors confirmed that no one had lived there since Harold had supposedly moved away after a stroke. The address Harold had given me was real, but Harold Blackwood, at least the man I'd met, the man who'd made Margaret's funeral arrangements and paid for her burial, didn't exist. Detective Martinez showed Harold's description to neighbors who'd known the Blackwoods for decades. None of them recognized the man I described. The real Harold Blackwood had been a tall, heavy-set man with a distinctive beard who died in 2021, 2 years before Margaret's death. He'd been cremated according to his wishes, and Margaret had lived alone in the house until her own death. So who was the man who'd claimed to be Harold? Who had arranged Margaret's funeral, selected her casket, and hidden 17 wedding rings in her burial lining? And why had he chosen Margaret Blackwood as the final resting place for what appeared to be trophies from multiple murders? The investigation expanded quickly. Forensics teams excavated Margaret's grave, hoping to find additional evidence. They discovered that her casket had been tampered with after burial. Someone had accessed it and made modifications that weren't visible from the surface. Margaret's body showed no signs of violence, but tissue samples revealed high levels of sedatives that hadn't been prescribed by any physician. More disturbing, the investigation revealed that Margaret Blackwood had been receiving regular visits from an unidentified man during the months before her death. Neighbors had assumed he was family, maybe a nephew or caregiver helping with her daily needs. But none of Margaret's actual relatives recognized the description, and no one had arranged for any kind of care assistance. The man I'd known as Harold had been visiting Margaret for at least 6 months, gaining her trust, learning her routines, positioning himself to control her final arrangements. The real question was whether Margaret had been his first victim or his final one. DNA analysis of the wedding rings revealed traces of blood that matched several of the missing women. The rings hadn't just been stolen, they'd been removed from bodies, probably after death, kept as souvenirs by someone who viewed murder as a form of collecting. Margaret's casket had become his trophy case, a place where he could preserve his accomplishments without fear of discovery. But the most chilling discovery came when forensics examined the modifications made to Margaret's casket after burial. Someone had installed a small ventilation system, creating air pockets that would have allowed a living person to survive underground for extended periods. Margaret's body showed signs of having been moved repeatedly, repositioned as if someone had been visiting her regularly, spending time with her in the darkness of her grave. The investigation painted a picture of a killer who'd used Margaret Blackwood's death as an opportunity to create a private mausoleum for his crimes. He'd drugged her gradually, arranged her funeral under a false identity, then used her burial site as a secret meeting place where he could relive his murders and plan future victims. 3 weeks after we'd discovered the rings, police found the man who'd posed as Harold Blackwood. He was living under another assumed identity in a neighboring county, already cultivating a relationship with an elderly widow whose husband had died 6 months earlier. When they arrested him, he was carrying a small notebook containing detailed plans for her funeral arrangements. His real name was Thomas Walsh, and he'd been killing women for over 15 years, always choosing victims whose disappearances could be explained away as domestic disputes or voluntary departures. He'd perfected a system of gaining the trust of elderly women, using them as accomplices and final victims, then hiding evidence of his crimes in their burial sites. During his confession, Walsh revealed that Margaret Blackwood hadn't been a victim, she'd been a willing participant. Lonely after her husband's death, grateful for the attention of a younger man who listened to her stories and made her feel valued, she'd agreed to help him with what he'd described as keeping mementos of lost loves. Margaret had known about the rings, had helped sew them into her casket lining, believing she was preserving the memory of women who'd been abandoned by uncaring husbands. Walsh had convinced her that he was collecting jewelry from divorce proceedings, saving wedding rings that would otherwise be thrown away or sold. In her isolation and grief, Margaret had found purpose in what she thought was a romantic gesture. Only in her final days, when the sedatives Walsh had been giving her began affecting her clarity, did Margaret begin to suspect the truth. Her neighbor found notes hidden in her bedroom, fragments of thoughts suggesting she'd realized the rings belonged to women who weren't divorced, they were dead. But by then, it was too late for her to change what she'd set in motion. Thomas Walsh was convicted on 17 counts of murder and sentenced to life without parole. The investigation led to the recovery of remains from several of the missing women, giving their families the closure they'd been seeking for years. But some questions remained unanswered, particularly about Margaret's final days and what she'd understood about her role in Walsh's crimes. We reburied Margaret in a new casket, without the rings that had turned her resting place into a monument to murder. Her family chose to hold a second funeral service, one that honored the woman she'd been before loneliness and manipulation had drawn her into Thomas Walsh's web of violence. But I still think about those 17 rings sometimes, about the women who'd worn them and trusted their husbands with their lives. I think about Margaret Blackwood, whose desire for companionship had made her vulnerable to a predator who understood exactly how to exploit grief and isolation. Most of all, I think about the responsibility I carry as someone who prepares the dead for their final rest. I've learned to look more carefully at the personal items families want buried with their loved ones, to ask more questions about relationships that seem too convenient or too perfect. Because sometimes the dead carry secrets that the living desperately need to discover, and sometimes a mortician is the only person positioned to notice when something beautiful is hiding something terrible. The 17 rings are evidence now, stored in a police facility where they'll remain until the appeals process is exhausted. But every time I prepare a burial, every time I arrange personal items in a casket, I remember that love can be twisted into something monstrous and that the symbols of devotion can become trophies of violence when they fall into the wrong hands. Some collections are meant to be discovered, and some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep you try to hide them in the earth. The Carpenter exhumation revealed we'd been caring for the wrong body. James Carpenter was supposed to be buried in Ohio, but his identical twin brother lay in the casket instead, carrying James's ID and a note apologizing for taking his place in line. I'm Patricia Morgan, and I've been a funeral director at Serenity Memorial for 21 years. My work demands absolute precision, the right body in the right casket, the right family saying goodbye to their actual loved one, the right remains going to their intended final resting place. Mistakes in this industry aren't just embarrassing. They're devastating for families who trust us with their most sacred farewells. But the Carpenter case taught me that sometimes the dead make their own arrangements, and that love between brothers can transcend identity, death, and even the careful records we keep to distinguish one soul from another. James Carpenter was 68 when he died of complications from diabetes, a retired postal worker who'd lived quietly in our town for 30 years. He'd moved here from Ohio after his wife died, seeking a fresh start, away from memories that had become too painful to face daily. His funeral was small, maybe 20 people, mostly neighbors and a few colleagues from the post office, where he'd worked part-time to stay busy during retirement. The service was exactly what James had prearranged. Simple casket, brief ceremony, burial in Hillcrest Cemetery, where he'd purchased a single plot years earlier. No family attended except for a distant cousin who'd driven down from Ohio to handle the estate and ensure James received proper burial rites. Everything proceeded according to plan. Everything documented with the meticulous care we give every service. 2 years later, that same cousin called with an unusual request. She'd been going through James's papers and discovered that he owned a family plot in Cleveland where his parents and grandparents were buried. She wanted to move his remains to Ohio so he could rest with his family, ending his self-imposed exile from the people who'd loved him most. I feel terrible that Uncle James was alone here, she explained during our meeting. He was so heartbroken after Aunt Carol died that he cut himself off from everyone who cared about him. But he belongs with family, not isolated in a cemetery where nobody visits his grave. It was a touching gesture, the kind of family reconciliation that makes this work meaningful despite its sadness. I scheduled the exhumation for the following month, arranged transport to Cleveland, and began the paperwork to transfer James Carpenter to his permanent resting place among 3 generations of family history. The exhumation proceeded routinely until we opened the casket for identification or verification. Standard procedure requires us to confirm the body's identity before transport, ensuring we're moving the correct remains to their new location. I expected to find James exactly as we'd left him 2 years earlier. Gray hair, postal service uniform, peaceful expression of a man who'd found rest after years of grief. Instead, I found a stranger. The man in James Carpenter's casket looked exactly like James. Same height, same build, same facial features, down to the smallest detail. But this wasn't the man we'd buried. His hands were different, softer, without the calluses that come from 30 years of sorting mail. His expression was more peaceful than resigned, suggesting someone who died content rather than weary. Most tellingly, he was wearing a suit I'd never seen before, expensive fabric that didn't match the simple clothing James had preferred. But clutched in his hands was James Carpenter's driver's license, social security card, and a handwritten note that explained everything while answering nothing. My name is Michael Carpenter, and I'm sorry for the deception. I died 3 days before my twin brother James was supposed to, and I couldn't bear the thought of him facing death alone. We switched places in the hospital. Nobody noticed because we'd been identical our whole lives, down to the scars from childhood accidents. James is alive and living under my name in Cleveland, taking care of my wife, who has Alzheimer's and doesn't realize her husband died. He's happier caring for someone who needs him than he ever was grieving alone. I'm content to rest in his place, knowing I gave him a reason to keep living. Please don't try to find him. Some gifts are meant to be accepted without question. I stared at that note for 10 minutes, trying to process what it meant. 2 identical brothers, one dead, one supposedly alive, but living under each other's names. A deception so complete that we'd been caring for the wrong body for 2 years without anyone, including me, realizing the substitution. The cousin confirmed that James had indeed had an identical twin brother, Michael, who'd lived in Cleveland and had been battling cancer during the same period. James was struggling with diabetes complications. But according to her records, Michael had died a week after James and had already been buried in the family plot they were trying to move James to. If this is Michael in the casket, she said, studying the note with confusion, then who's buried in Cleveland? And where is James? We called the cemetery in Cleveland, asked them to verify the identity of Michael Carpenter's remains. What they discovered defied every assumption we'd made about the case. The grave marked as Michael Carpenter was empty, not robbed, not disturbed, just empty, as if no one had ever been buried there, despite clear records of a funeral service and interment. Meanwhile, the note in Michael's hands suggested that James was alive, living under his brother's identity, caring for a sister-in-law who wouldn't know the difference between identical twins. The substitution had been perfect, motivated by love rather than deception, designed to give James a purpose that his own grief-stricken life had lacked. I struggled with what to do next. Michael Carpenter's note specifically asked us not to search for James, to accept the gift he'd given his brother without trying to undo it. But we had responsibilities to the family, obligations to maintain accurate records, and legal requirements to report suspected fraud even when the motives were purely compassionate. The cousin made the decision for us. After reading Michael's note several times, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the casket. Michael always took care of James when they were growing up, she said quietly. James was the sensitive one, the one who felt everything too deeply. When their parents died, Michael made sure James was okay. When James's wife died, Michael was the one who called to check on him every day, even while he was dying of cancer himself. She paused, looking at Michael's peaceful face in the casket. If Michael found a way to give James a reason to live, who am I to interfere? James is taking care of someone who needs him, probably for the first time since Carol died. That's exactly what Michael would have wanted. We proceeded with the burial as planned, interring Michael Carpenter in the family plot under his brother's name. The records show James Carpenter at rest in Cleveland, which is technically accurate even if the identity is more complex than our documentation suggests. The cousin returns to visit the grave annually, bringing flowers for both brothers and keeping their secret safe. I never tried to verify whether James is actually alive in Cleveland, caring for his sister-in-law under his brother's identity. Some mysteries are too precious to solve, some deceptions too loving to expose. What matters is that two brothers found a way to take care of each other beyond death, ensuring that neither of them faced their final challenges alone. But sometimes, when I'm reviewing burial records or preparing identical twins for funeral services, I think about the Carpenter brothers and wonder how many other secret substitutions have happened without detection. How many times have the living and the dead changed places out of love, creating new identities that serve the needs of both worlds? Because identity is more than just names and documentation. It's about the love we carry for each other, the sacrifices we're willing to make, and the lengths we'll go to ensure that the people we care about find peace. Michael Carpenter understood this, and his final gift to his brother was a chance to be needed again, to find purpose in caring for someone else instead of drowning in his own grief. That's a legacy worth preserving, even if it means keeping the wrong name on the right grave and trusting that love knows its own geography, regardless of what the official records say about who's buried where. Maria Gonzalez's casket was empty, but still sealed when we opened it for reinterment, containing only a tape recorder playing her voice counting backwards from 100 because she'd always been terrified of being buried alive. I'm Tom Mitchell, and I've been digging graves at Sacred Heart Cemetery for 16 years. It's physical work, honest work, and I take pride in creating the final resting places where families can say goodbye to their loved ones with dignity. Every grave I dig is measured precisely, prepared carefully, and blessed properly before we lower anyone into the earth. But Maria Gonzalez's grave taught me that some fears run deeper than death itself, and that terror can be powerful enough to prevent a soul from staying where the living think it belongs. Maria came to us on a cold February morning, 54 years old, victim of a sudden heart attack that took her while she was reading in her favorite chair. Her sister Carmen made the arrangements, requesting a traditional Catholic service with burial in Sacred Heart's consecrated ground where their parents had been laid to rest decades earlier. Maria had been a devout woman, active in the church community, the kind of person whose faith should have made death feel like a transition rather than an ending. But Carmen shared something during our initial meeting that stayed with me through the entire burial process. Maria had suffered from severe claustrophobia her entire life, a fear so intense that she couldn't ride in elevators, sleep in small rooms, or even wear clothing that felt too restrictive. Her greatest terror was being buried alive, trapped underground with no way to escape or call for help. She made me promise a dozen times to check on her after the funeral, Carmen said, tears streaming down her face. She wanted me to wait exactly 6 months, then have her grave opened to make absolutely sure she was really dead. I know it sounds crazy, but the fear was so real for her. She had nightmares about waking up in a casket, scratching at the lid until her fingernails were gone. I'd heard similar requests before, families asking for elaborate precautions against premature burial, special caskets with emergency mechanisms, even electronic monitoring systems that could detect signs of life after interment. Most of these fears were rooted in old stories and medical ignorance. But for people like Maria, the terror was genuine and overwhelming. Carmen had tried to convince Maria to choose cremation, to avoid burial entirely, but Maria's faith prohibited it. She believed in bodily resurrection and couldn't accept any practice that destroyed the physical form she hoped to reclaim at the end of times. So she'd chosen burial while living in constant fear of what that choice might mean if the doctors were wrong about her death. I dug Maria's grave with extra care, ensuring the walls were perfectly straight and the depth was exactly regulation. I wanted everything perfect for a woman whose final fear deserved respect, even if it seemed irrational to those of us who understood that modern medicine eliminated the possibility of premature burial. The funeral was beautiful, attended by 300 people whose lives Maria had touched through her work with the church's charity programs. Carmen held herself together through the service, but I could see the anxiety in her eyes as we lowered Maria's casket into the grave I'd prepared. She was already counting the days until she could fulfill her promise to check on her sister, already planning the exhumation that would give them both peace. 6 months passed slowly. Carmen called me twice a week to confirm that the exhumation was still scheduled, to make sure I understood how important this was for her family's ability to grieve properly. She'd arranged everything through the proper legal channels, obtained court approval for the disinterment, and paid for the additional services required to reopen a consecrated grave. The morning of the exhumation, Carmen arrived early, bringing 24 white roses and a small religious medal she wanted to place with Maria's remains. She looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, torn between hope that her sister was truly at rest and terror that they might find evidence of the nightmare scenario that had haunted Maria throughout her life. We reached Maria's casket around 10 a.m. After 3 hours of careful excavation, the vault was intact, properly sealed, showing no signs of disturbance or moisture infiltration. Everything appeared exactly as we'd left it 6 months earlier. But when we lifted the casket and transported it to the cemetery's inspection facility, I noticed immediately that something was wrong with the weight distribution. The casket felt too light, as if it contained less than it should. Maria had been a small woman, maybe 120 pounds, but the casket felt like it held nothing substantial at all. Carmen noticed it too, her face growing pale as we positioned the casket for opening. "Something's wrong," she whispered. "It doesn't feel like she's in there." When we unsealed the casket, we found it empty except for Maria's burial clothes, folded neatly in the corner as if she'd undressed and laid them aside. Her jewelry was arranged carefully on the satin lining her wedding ring, the cross necklace she'd worn every day, the rosary Carmen had placed in her hands during the viewing. But Maria herself was gone. Carmen stared into the empty casket for a long moment, then began searching frantically through the silk lining and beneath the pillow where Maria's head should have been resting. That's when she found the tape recorder. It was small, digital, the kind of device people use for voice memos or recording lectures. It had been hidden beneath the casket's false bottom, connected to a tiny speaker that had been positioned near where Maria's ear would have been. The device was still running, the battery indicator showing it had been operating continuously for the entire 6 months since burial. When Carmen pressed the playback button, we heard Maria's voice, clear and unmistakable, counting backwards from 100, 100, 99, 98, 97. The countdown was slow, deliberate, with long pauses between numbers as if Maria were trying to stay calm while fighting off panic. Her voice remained steady until she reached the 20s, then began to show signs of strain. By the time she reached single digits, she was whispering, her words barely audible through what sounded like tears. 3, 2, 1, 0. Then silence for exactly 60 seconds, followed by Maria's voice starting over again. 100, 99, 98. The tape contained hundreds of these countdown cycles, Maria's voice repeating the same pattern over and over, counting down from 100 to 0, pausing, then beginning again. Each cycle took about 10 minutes, meaning she'd been counting continuously since the moment of burial, never stopping, never resting, maintaining her vigil against the darkness that surrounded her. But the most disturbing part was how her voice changed over time. In the early recordings, she sounded frightened but determined, using the countdown as a way to stay focused and maintain hope. As the cycles continued, her voice became more distant, more ethereal, as if she were speaking from increasingly far away. By the final recordings, Maria's voice was barely a whisper, so faint that we had to strain to hear the numbers. But she never stopped counting, never gave up the rhythm that was keeping her connected to the world of the living, even as she drifted further into whatever space exists between life and death. Carmen listened to several hours of the recording, tears streaming down her face as she heard her sister's voice speaking to the darkness month after month. The countdown had become Maria's prayer, her way of measuring time and maintaining sanity in the face of her worst fear, realized being conscious and aware while trapped in a grave. She was awake, Carmen whispered. All this time, she was awake and counting, trying to stay calm until someone came to check on her. She kept her promise to wait for me. We never found Maria's body, though we searched the entire cemetery and investigated every possibility, from grave robbery to medical error. The official explanation was that the burial had been mishandled, that Maria's remains had been lost through administrative mistake or professional negligence. But Carmen and I knew the truth was more complex and more heartbreaking. Maria Gonzalez had been so terrified of premature burial that her consciousness had somehow remained active after death, trapped in the awful liminal space between living and dying. She'd spent 6 months in the darkness of her grave, counting down from 100 over and over again, waiting for the promise Carmen had made to bring her peace. When we held the second funeral service this time, just Carmen and a few close friends gathering to honor Maria's memory, we buried the tape recorder in a small casket, letting Maria's voice finally rest beneath the earth where her body should have been. Carmen spoke about her sister's courage, about the strength it must have taken to count through 6 months of darkness, without losing hope that rescue would eventually come. The recording stopped the day we opened Maria's empty casket, as if her vigil had finally ended with the knowledge that someone had kept their promise to check on her. Carmen visits the grave every week now, bringing fresh flowers and sitting quietly beside the headstone that marks the place where Maria's fear finally found peace. I still think about that countdown when I'm digging new graves, about the terror that can follow us into death, and the promises that can sustain us through impossible circumstances. I dig each grave a little deeper now, with extra care for drainage and ventilation, because I've learned that some fears are too powerful to be buried, and some souls need more space to breathe, even when breathing should no longer be necessary. And sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in the cemetery, I swear I can hear the faint sound of someone counting backwards from 100, maintaining their vigil against the darkness, keeping time until the people who love them remember to keep their promises and bring them home. Frank Mueller's casket was filled with fresh soil and earthworms when we opened it, but his body was found sitting peacefully in his favorite chair at the house next to the cemetery, a house that had been demolished the same day as his funeral. I'm Valerie Chen, and I've been supervising transport operations for Eternal Rest Services for 19 years. My job involves coordinating the movement of deceased individuals from funeral homes to their final resting places, ensuring that every person reaches their intended destination with dignity and proper documentation. I've handled thousands of transports, from routine burials to complex international repatriations, and I thought I'd seen every possible complication that could arise in moving the dead. But Frank Mueller's case taught me that some people have their own ideas about where they want to spend eternity, and that the earth itself sometimes participates in arrangements we never authorized. Frank Mueller was 91 when he died, a retired carpenter who'd lived alone in the same house for 67 years. He'd built the place himself in 1956, a small craftsman bungalow on Maple Street that bordered the old section of Greenwood Cemetery. Frank loved that house with the kind of devotion most people reserve for family, spending decades maintaining and improving every detail, until it was exactly what he'd envisioned as a young man starting his life. His nephew Gary made the funeral arrangements, explaining that Frank had no other living relatives and had left specific instructions for his burial. Frank wanted to be interred in Greenwood Cemetery, as close as possible to his property line, where he could keep an eye on the old place even in death. It was a touching final wish from a man who'd never really left home, who'd found his piece of paradise and refused to abandon it. The funeral was simple but well attended. Frank had been a fixture in the neighborhood for 7 decades, the kind of man who'd helped his neighbors with repairs, who'd given away vegetables from his garden, who'd sat on his front porch every evening watching the world change around him. 3 generations of families came to say goodbye to someone who'd been a constant, reassuring presence in their community. We buried Frank on a Tuesday morning in October, in a plot maybe 50 yards from the back fence of his property. From his grave, you could see the house he'd built, the garden he'd tended, the workshop where he'd crafted furniture for his neighbors' children and grandchildren. It seemed like the perfect resting place for a man whose entire world had been contained within those few acres of earth. But something strange happened during the burial that should have warned us about the complications to come. As we were lowering Frank's casket into the grave, the ropes on the mechanical lowering device began pulling in the opposite direction, as if something underground was trying to draw the casket deeper than regulation depth. It took 4 of us to control the descent, and even then, the casket seemed reluctant to settle into its intended position. Gary mentioned that the city had scheduled Frank's house for demolition the same day as the funeral. The property had been sold to developers who planned to build a small apartment complex, and they wanted the old house removed immediately to begin construction. It seemed like terrible timing, but Gary said Frank had known about the sale and had accepted it as the natural conclusion of his time as the neighborhood's guardian. 3 weeks after the burial, Gary called with an unusual request. He'd been driving past Frank's property and noticed that the demolition had been delayed, not due to permits or legal issues, but because workers kept reporting strange problems at the site. Equipment malfunctions, tools disappearing and reappearing in wrong locations, the sound of someone working in the basement when the house was supposed to be empty. "I know this sounds crazy," Gary said, "but I think Uncle Frank might be, I don't know, still living there somehow." The construction foreman says they can hear someone moving around inside, but when they check, the house is always empty. The neighbors have been calling too, saying they see lights in the windows at night. I suggested that squatters had probably moved into the vacant house, or that vandals were using it as a meeting place. But Gary was insistent that something supernatural was happening, that Frank was somehow refusing to accept his displacement from the home he'd spent his entire adult life perfecting. The situation escalated when the demolition crew finally attempted to begin work. According to their foreman, every piece of equipment that entered Frank's property would mysteriously break down within hours. Bulldozers would lose hydraulic pressure, excavators would develop electrical problems, and hand tools would simply disappear from locked storage containers. The crew reported feeling watched from the house's windows, and several workers claimed to see an elderly man in overalls standing on the front porch, shaking his head disapprovingly at their activities. Gary decided to investigate personally, using his key to enter Frank's house and search for evidence of unauthorized occupation. What he found convinced him that we needed to examine Frank's grave immediately. The house was exactly as Frank had left it before entering the hospital for his final illness. Furniture in perfect condition, tools arranged neatly in the workshop, fresh coffee in the kitchen pot as if someone had just finished breakfast. Most disturbing, Frank's favorite chair, a leather recliner he'd positioned to overlook both his garden and the cemetery, showed clear signs of recent use. The cushions were compressed, the side table held a glass of water and reading glasses, and there was even a warm impression in the leather, as if someone had just stood up. Gary called me that afternoon, requesting an immediate exhumation to verify that Frank was actually in his grave. It seemed like an extreme response to what could easily be explained as grief-induced imagination. But something in Gary's voice convinced me that we needed to take his concerns seriously. We scheduled the exhumation for the following Monday, obtaining the necessary permits and assembling a crew for what we expected would be a routine verification. Frank had only been buried for 6 weeks, so we anticipated finding him exactly as we'd left him, properly positioned in his casket and showing the normal signs of early decomposition. Instead, we found Frank's casket filled with rich, dark soil and dozens of earthworms, as if someone had opened it and replaced his body with fresh earth from a well-tended garden. The soil wasn't the clay and sand mixture that characterizes Greenwood Cemetery's geology. This was the kind of fertile, composted earth that comes from decades of careful cultivation, the type of soil Frank had spent years creating in his vegetable garden. Mixed through the dirt were seeds, tomatoes, carrots, beans, all the vegetables Frank had grown and shared with his neighbors for decades. But most impossible of all, the soil was warm, not body temperature, but the gentle warmth of earth that's been recently turned and watered, ready for spring planting. The earthworms moving through the dirt were active and healthy, as if they'd been living in optimal conditions rather than buried 6 feet underground in a sealed casket. Gary stared into the open casket for a long moment, then looked toward Frank's house, visible through the cemetery trees. "He's not here," he said quietly. "He never was here. He went back home, and somehow the earth followed him." We drove to Frank's property immediately, Gary using his key to enter the house he'd searched just days earlier. This time, we found Frank Mueller sitting peacefully in his leather recliner, exactly as he'd appeared in life, wearing the same overalls and flannel shirt Gary remembered from childhood visits. Frank looked up when we entered, smiled with the kind of satisfaction that comes from a job well done, and nodded toward the window overlooking his garden. Outside, vegetables were growing in perfect rows, despite the fact that it was late October and the first frost had already killed every other garden in the neighborhood. "Couldn't leave the place unattended," Frank said in a voice as clear and strong as it had been during his final illness. "Too much work left to do. Too many things that need proper care. The developers can wait. This house isn't finished being a home yet." Gary tried to speak, to ask questions that had no rational answers. But Frank held up his hand with the gentle authority of someone who'd spent 9 decades solving problems with patience and practical wisdom. "I'm not dead." "Exactly. And I'm not alive in any way you'd understand. I'm something in between, something the earth decided to keep close because my work here isn't finished. The soil in my casket will keep growing vegetables for families who need them. The house will keep standing until someone worthy comes along to care for it properly. And I'll keep doing what I've always done, making sure this little piece of the world stays as close to perfect as human hands can make it." We left Frank in his chair, overlooking the garden that defied every law of seasons and death, in the house that refused to be demolished despite being scheduled for destruction. The developers eventually gave up their plans, claiming the property was unsuitable for development due to geological anomalies. The city quietly removed it from the demolition list, and Gary arranged for the utilities to remain connected indefinitely. Frank Mueller's official grave remains empty, except for the rich soil that continues to sprout vegetables every spring. Neighbors have started visiting the cemetery to harvest tomatoes and beans from what they've come to call Frank's final garden, sharing the produce just as he'd shared it in life. And the house on Maple Street continues to be occupied by someone who understands that home isn't just a place you live. It's a responsibility you carry, a piece of the earth you're trusted to improve, a legacy that transcends the simple distinction between breathing and not breathing. Because some people are so rooted in the places they love that death becomes just another renovation project, another challenge to overcome, with patience, determination, and the kind of practical wisdom that comes from spending a lifetime making things better than you found them.